Hey there, night owls! The year is 407. Emperor Constantine III marches the last Roman legions off the shores of Britain, and just like that, the lights supposedly go out. Your old history teacher swore it. Rome packed civilization in its suitcase and left the island to rot for 5 whole centuries. Empty towns, fields gone to weeds, and a bunch of folks who forgot how to do anything except wait for a king named Arthur to save the day. Welcome to the so-called Dark Ages. But here is the plot twist nobody handed you in school. What if the lights never went out? Archaeologist Francis Pryor says when Rome left, Britain didn't crumble, it flared up brighter than ever, and tonight we're not taking anyone's word for it. No dusty legends, no royal fan fiction. We let the real witnesses talk. Broken pots, old bones, weathered stones, and even fossilized pollen, the nosiest little tattletale on the planet. So dim those lights, get comfy, and before we dig in, do me a quick favour. Tap that like button if forgotten history is your thing, and drop a comment telling me where on this big blue planet you're watching from. What city, and what time is it where you sit? Alright, lanterns up. Let's go. Before we go chasing pots and bones across muddy fields, we need to settle the most obvious question of the whole story, the one nobody ever seems to ask. If the lights really went out in Britain after Rome packed up and left, then somebody, somewhere, must have flipped the switch. So who was it? Who decided that an entire stretch of history, 5 centuries of human lives, weddings, harvests, arguments, gossip, and the occasional decent harvest festival, should be filed away under the gloomy heading of darkness and quietly forgotten? You would assume the answer lives back in the 5th century, with the legions marching off and the last lamp guttering out somewhere in a damp Roman bathhouse. You would be wrong. The hand on that switch belonged to people who lived more than 1,000 years later, wore very tight collars, and had a great deal invested in making the past behave itself. Here is the part that tends to surprise people. The whole idea of the Dark Ages, the very phrase, the mental picture of crumbling towns and weed-choked fields and shacky barbarians huddled around smoky fires, is not really a product of the 5th century at all. It is a product of the 19th. The grim story you were taught was, in a sense, freshly painted by men in waistcoats far closer to our own time than to the events they were describing. And once you know who painted it, and why, the whole canvas starts to look a little less like a documentary and a lot more like a mood board. To understand why, you have to picture the world that early British archaeology was born into. This was the age of the British Empire at its absolute peak, a sprawling enterprise that stretched across so much of the globe that, as the boast went, the sun never set on it. And empires, it turns out, are deeply anxious things. They spend an astonishing amount of energy worrying about their own mortality. The Victorians who ran this one looked around for a flattering mirror, somebody great and impressive to compare themselves to, and they found exactly what they were looking for in ancient Rome. Rome had roads, law, plumbing, conquest, marble, and an empire that touched 3 continents. Britain conveniently had all of those things too, give or take the marble. So the Victorian elite quietly adopted Rome as a kind of distinguished older relative, a model of what a proper civilization should look like, which is a lovely arrangement until you remember one slightly awkward detail about Rome. It fell. This is where the anxiety creeps in. If you have spent decades telling yourself you are the new Rome, then the fall of the old Rome stops being ancient history and starts feeling uncomfortably like a weather forecast. And so a particular reading of the past became extremely convenient. If you could show that the collapse of a great empire was always, inevitably followed by total catastrophe, by darkness and chaos and the comprehensive ruin of everything good, then you had yourself a powerful warning. Hold the empire together at all costs, the lesson ran, because the alternative is 5 centuries of squalor. The Dark Ages, in other words, were not just a description of Britain after Rome. They were a cautionary tale aimed squarely at Britain in the present, dressed up in 5th century clothes. The past was being recruited, somewhat against its will, to scare the living daylights out of the future. But you cannot build a cautionary tale out of nothing, and this is where the genuinely fascinating bit comes in. The Victorians did not need to invent evidence of disaster. They simply needed evidence of nothing, and that they had in abundance. After the Romans left, the written record in Britain goes alarmingly quiet. The coins stop. The neat administrative documents stop. The tidy inscriptions stop. For long stretches there is essentially no paperwork at all, and to a certain kind of 19th century historian, no paperwork meant no civilization, which is a bit like walking into a library after closing time, finding the lights off and the desk unmanned, and concluding that literacy itself has collapsed. Underneath all of this sat one more assumption, so deep that most Victorians never noticed they were making it: the comfortable conviction that history runs in a straight line and that line points relentlessly upward. Progress, in this view, was the natural order of things, a steady climb from rude beginnings toward ever greater refinement, with their own glittering age perched triumphantly at the summit. A story like that has very little room in it for the idea that life after Rome might simply have been different rather than worse, that people might have reorganised themselves into something perfectly functional that just happened not to involve marble baths and tidy paperwork. Anything that did not look like a march toward Victorian civilization was, almost by reflex, filed under decline. Difference got read as failure, and a change of direction got mistaken for a fall off a cliff, which is roughly how you end up describing 5 centuries of ordinary human life as a hole in the ground. The man who put this attitude into its most quotable form was the historian Frank Stenton, whose volume in the Great Oxford History of England became something close to scripture for generations of students. Writing about the gap between the end of Roman rule and the emergence of the recognisable English kingdoms, Stenton more or less threw up his hands. The period, he declared, was one for which it was simply not possible to write a history at all. The sources were too thin, too contradictory, too unreliable. And while that is a perfectly honest thing for a careful scholar to admit, watch what happens next, because this is where honesty quietly mutates into mythology. A blank page is not the same thing as a blank country. The absence of records is not the presence of ruins. But the human brain, unfortunately, hates a vacuum, and so those empty pages did not stay empty for long. They got filled in, not with evidence, but with imagination, and the imagination of the time was working from a very specific palette of weeds, mud, abandonment, and decline. Picture the process. A historian opens the book of the 5th century, finds the pages stubbornly blank, and rather than writing nothing across them, which would be the cautious move, reaches instead for the most dramatic story available. Cities, the story went, must have emptied out. Fields surely returned to wilderness. The hard-won apparatus of Roman life, the baths and the underfloor heating and the imported tableware, must have rusted and rotted and vanished, leaving the survivors to scratch a miserable living from the dirt while waiting for someone, anyone, to restore a little order. None of this came from a document. All of it came from a mood, the mood of an empire nervously contemplating its own funeral, and projecting that fear backwards onto a screen that happened to be conveniently empty. And then there is the matter of the hero, because every good gloomy story needs one bright figure to throw the shadows into relief, and Britain had a ready-made candidate waiting in the wings, King Arthur. Now the Arthur most of us carry around in our heads, the round table, the shining armour, the doomed romance, the wizard with the impressive beard, is itself a fairly late confection, polished and embroidered over many centuries. But the Victorians took a particular shine to him, and they reshaped him to fit their own image of moral excellence. In the grand halls of Westminster, in the very House of Lords, Arthur was painted and sculpted and woven into the national story as the embodiment of a set of virtues the Victorians prized enormously. The upright, chivalrous, vaguely Germanic ideals they liked to call Teutonic, all duty and restraint and noble suffering. He became less a 5th century warlord and more a 19th century gentleman in fancy dress, a sort of moral mascot. The point is not that Arthur was made up out of thin air. The point is that the Arthur enshrined in those great halls tells you far more about the men who put him there than about anything that may or may not have happened 1500 years ago. He was, in the most literal sense, a figure of the present wearing the costume of the past. And the Victorians did not keep this reinvented Arthur tucked away in dusty council chambers. They put him everywhere. The poet Alfred Tennyson spent decades pouring out long, lavish verses about the king and his knights, a sprawling cycle of poems that the public devoured with the kind of enthusiasm later generations would reserve for serial television. Painters filled gallery walls with dreamy, soft-focus scenes of doomed romance and noble sacrifice, all flowing robes and meaningful glances. Wealthy households commissioned tapestries and stained glass on the same themes, and for a while it seemed a respectable home was not quite complete without at least one tragic knight gazing wistfully off a wall. None of this art was remotely interested in the gritty, half-glimpsed reality of 5th century Britain. It was interested in feelings, in chivalry and longing, and the bittersweet collapse of something beautiful, which, not at all by coincidence, were precisely the emotions an anxious empire enjoyed wallowing in while quietly worrying about its own eventual sunset. The further the real evidence receded into the fog, naturally, the more freely the imagination was allowed to redecorate, and redecorate it did, in the lushest possible style. Which brings us to the single most useful idea in this entire story, the one tool you can carry with you through everything that follows. History is never just a record of what happened. It is always, also, a story told by living people for the benefit of living people, and the living always have an agenda, even when they sincerely believe they do not. The Victorians were not lying exactly. Most of them genuinely believed in the darkness they described. But belief is not the same as fact, and the version of the past that wins out is very often the one that the present finds most useful, most flattering, or most frightening, depending on what it needs at the time. Every generation, in effect, rewrites history to suit itself, which is a humbling thought when you remember that this very story, the one being told right now, is also being told by people of the present, and ought to be checked just as carefully as all the rest. So let us start checking, beginning with the most basic distinction of all, because the trouble usually starts when two completely different things get smuggled into the same word. There is the date, and there is the disaster, and they are not remotely the same thing. The date is solid. Around the years 407 to 410, the Roman military presence in Britain effectively ended, the last organised legions departed, and the imperial machine that had run the island for nearly 4 centuries switched off. That much is genuinely well established, an actual event with an actual timestamp, the kind of thing you can pin to a wall. But the disaster, the collapse, the descent into darkness, that is not a date at all. That is an interpretation, a story laid over the top of the date, and a story that, as we're about to discover field by field and pot by pot, the ground itself flatly refuses to confirm. A departure is a fact, a catastrophe is a claim. And one of the quiet pleasures of the chapters ahead is watching that claim fall apart in slow motion, buried under the weight of evidence the Victorians never bothered to dig up, mostly because they already knew, or thought they knew, what they were going to find. That, then, is our frame, the lens we'll hold up to everything from here on. Whenever someone tells you the past was simply one way, ask who benefits from it being told like that, and then go and look at what was actually left in the dirt. And once you start looking, a curious thing happens. It is not only the ending of Roman Britain that turns out to have been quietly rewritten to suit a later audience. The beginning was given exactly the same treatment, only in reverse, and it is just as much of a fairy tale. Because here is the version most of us absorbed somewhere around the age of 9. Rome, the great war machine, the unstoppable juggernaut of disciplined legions and gleaming eagles, descends upon a damp little island full of woad-painted savages and simply crushes them. The mighty civilizer arrives, the primitive natives resist hopelessly, and within a generation the conquerors have generously dragged the locals out of the bushes and into the wonders of straight roads and hot baths whether they wanted them or not. It is a tidy story, with a clear hero and a clear set of helpless extras, and like most tidy stories about the past, it falls apart the moment you start poking at the actual evidence. The conquest of 43 was a great many things, but a tale of brute force flattening the defenceless was not really one of them. Start with the savages, or rather, start by retiring that word entirely, because it does a spectacular amount of damage. Pre-Roman Britain was not a single nation of face-painted primitives waiting to be civilized. It was not a single nation of anything. It was a patchwork, a scattered collection of tribal kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own territory, its own rivalries, alliances, grudges, and ambitions, and these kingdoms spent a great deal of their time doing what neighbouring kingdoms have always done, which is squabbling with one another over land, status, and the local equivalent of bragging rights. The idea that Rome arrived to find one unified Britain to conquer is roughly as accurate as imagining that a single phone call could put every quarrelsome family in a large neighbourhood on the same page. These people were not a country, they were a crowd, and a fractious one at that, which turns out to matter enormously for how the so-called conquest actually unfolded. And far from cowering in fear of the distant superpower across the water, many of these British rulers had spent decades cultivating warm and frankly profitable relationships with Rome long before a single invading boot touched the beach, We are not guessing at this. We can hold the proof in our hands because some of these people were buried with it. Near Colchester in the southeast, archaeologists uncovered a burial dating to roughly a decade before the birth of Christ, well over half a century before the famous invasion, and it is not the grave of someone who feared or hated Rome. It is the grave of someone who could not get enough of it. Tucked in among the remains were luxuries that had travelled a very long way to get there. Roman wine of the sort that did not come cheap, finely worked bronze, and, most telling of all, a silver medallion bearing the image of the Emperor Augustus himself, the founder of the Roman imperial line. This was not loot. This was not the spoils of resistance. This was a status symbol, the ancient British equivalent of a man being buried with the keys to a very expensive imported car, a way of saying to the afterlife and to everyone left behind that here lay somebody important, somebody connected, somebody who did business with the most powerful man alive. The relationship between Britain and Rome, in other words, was not born in 43 with a clash of armies. It had been quietly maturing for generations, lubricated by trade, gifts, and a healthy mutual interest in money. That maturity shows up in a place you might not think to look, on the coins these British rulers minted for themselves. Long before any invasion, several of the southern kingdoms were striking their own coinage, and they were not stamping it with stern Celtic mysticism. They were copying Rome, putting Latin words on the metal, sometimes proudly labelling their kings with the Latin title for king, occasionally borrowing Roman gods and imagery wholesale. A leader who advertises himself in the language of a distant superpower is not a man bracing for war with that superpower. He is a man eager to be seen as its peer, its associate, its sophisticated friend, the ancient equivalent of dropping fashionable foreign phrases into conversation to show you move in the right circles. The kingdoms involved had names worth remembering, because they keep reappearing in the story. Verica ruled the Atrebates in the south. To their north sat the Catuvelauni, an ambitious and expansionist people who had been steadily swallowing their neighbours, and it was this aggressive northern power, hungry for more territory, that almost certainly drove Verica from his throne. The conquest of 43, in other words, did not drop out of a clear sky onto a peaceful land. It landed in the middle of a long-running local power struggle, and Rome was simply the heavyweight one of the losing sides decided to call in. So if Britain and Rome were already on such friendly terms, with wine flowing and medallions changing hands, why did an army ever turn up at all? The answer is gloriously unheroic, and it has nothing to do with Rome bravely deciding to civilize the benighted natives. It has to do with a falling out among the natives themselves and a man who lost. His name was Verica, and he was the king of a people called the Atrebates, who held sway over a chunk of the south. Verica was, by all accounts, one of Rome's friends, a client ruler of exactly the cosy, business-friendly type the Colchester burial represents. The trouble was that Verica had enemies closer to home, rival British kingdoms that were expanding, and at some point these rivals got the upper hand and threw him out of his own lands entirely. Deposed, exiled, and presumably extremely annoyed, Verica did what an ambitious loser with powerful friends has always done. He went and complained to someone bigger. The someone bigger, in this case, was the Emperor Claudius, and the timing could hardly have been better for him. Claudius was a new emperor with something to prove, the kind of ruler who badly needed a glorious military victory to shore up his reputation, and here was a deposed king practically gift-wrapping a justification for invasion and laying it at his feet. "Restore me," Verica was effectively saying, "and you get to look like a mighty conqueror into the bargain." From Rome's point of view, this was not aggression. It was an invitation, an intervention on behalf of a wronged ally, which is the sort of language great powers have always preferred when explaining why their soldiers are suddenly standing on someone else's beach. And so in the year 43, an army under the command of a general named Aulus Plautius crossed the Channel, not as a horde of strangers smashing their way into a hostile land, but, at least in the official telling and in the eyes of a good many locals, as something closer to a liberator arriving to set things right. The conquest, such as it was, came at least partly by invitation. The savages had asked for the favour. Claudius, for his part, was not about to let a general hog all the credit for a victory he so badly needed, and so he arranged one of the more theatrical cameos in ancient history. Once the hard early fighting was done, and the outcome more or less settled, the emperor himself sailed over for a carefully staged personal appearance, and he did not arrive empty-handed. He brought elephants, Whether or not the great beast ever did anything more strenuous than lend an unforgettable air of menace to the proceedings, the message they sent was crystal clear, that the master of the known world had personally taken an interest in this damp northern island, and had brought along the most exotic animals in his menagerie to underline the point. At Colchester, the very stronghold of those expansionist neighbours, a gathering of British rulers formally acknowledged Roman authority, and Claudius collected the moment he had crossed a continent to obtain. He stayed only a matter of days, just long enough to be present for the spectacle, and then sailed home to celebrate, having spent barely longer in Britain than a modern tourist might spend on a long weekend, and having extracted from it a reputation as a conqueror that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily good return on a very short trip. Now you might reasonably ask where exactly this momentous army splashed ashore, and here the story takes another quiet turn, because even the landing site, one of the supposedly fixed points of British history, turns out to rest on rather shakier ground than the textbooks let on. The classic account, the one drilled into generations of students, has the legions landing at Richborough on the far southeastern tip of Kent, and then fighting a great set-piece clash known as the Battle of the Medway, a dramatic river crossing where Roman discipline supposedly broke the native resistance. It is a satisfying story, full of incident and decisive action. The slightly inconvenient detail is that a good deal of it appears to have been assembled less from hard evidence, and more from the comfortable confines of a study, the kind of confident reconstruction that scholars build by reasoning about where an invasion ought to have gone, rather than where it can actually be shown to have gone. It is, in short, the sort of history that sounds wonderful at a lectern and gets a little vaguer the closer you look at the actual ground. Because if you stop reasoning from the armchair and start thinking like the people who are actually there, a different and frankly more sensible possibility opens up. Remember Verica, the whole reason the army came in the first place. His lands lay not in the far corner of Kent but further west, around the natural harbour near what is now Chichester, on the south coast. If the entire point of the expedition was to restore a friendly king to his own territory, then landing an army hundreds of miles away in someone else's backyard makes very little tactical sense, whereas coming ashore right in the heart of Verica's own kingdom, among a population already inclined to welcome you, makes a great deal of it. You do not, after all, mount a rescue mission and then deliberately disembark at the wrong house. The harbour at Chichester, sheltered, well-placed, and sitting squarely in friendly territory, fits the actual purpose of the invasion far more snugly than the dramatic but awkwardly located beaches of the traditional tale. And as it happens, that stretch of the south coast holds the single most extraordinary piece of evidence in this entire chapter. A building so grand, so lavish, and so completely at odds with the image of a brutally conquered backwater that it forces you to rethink the whole relationship from the ground up. Just outside Chichester sit the remains of Fishbourne, and Fishbourne is not a fort, not a barracks, not a grim outpost of military occupation. It is a palace, and not a modest one. By the standards of the Roman world it was colossal, the largest Roman residence ever found in Britain, and one of the largest anywhere north of the Mediterranean. A sprawling complex of rooms, courtyards and gardens on a scale that, to put it in terms we can actually feel, comfortably outsized Buckingham Palace. We are talking about a residence supported by something in the region of 160 columns, floored and roofed and decorated to a standard that would not have embarrassed a wealthy household back in Italy itself. This was not improvised local grandeur cobbled together from whatever was lying around. The materials announced the ambition all on their own. Roughly 100 tons of roof tile alone were shipped in from Italy, hauled across the entire breadth of the empire and over the sea, simply to keep the rain off in a manner the owner considered acceptable. When you're importing 100 tons of anything from 1,000 miles away purely for the look of the thing, you're not a beaten people, you're showing off. The showing off did not stop at the walls and the roof either. Excavators working through the grounds found the unmistakable traces of formal gardens, the planting trenches dug to hold neat hedges laid out in geometric patterns, the kind of manicured ornamental landscape that has nothing to do with growing food and everything to do with announcing that you're far too important to worry about growing food. This was decoration for its own sake, leisure made visible, a garden whose entire purpose was to be strolled through and admired, set down in a corner of the empire that the conquest fairy tale insists had just been violently subdued. People living under the boot of a brutal occupation do not, as a rule, find the time or the confidence to lay out ornamental flower beds. The garden, like the columns and the imported tile, is the calm boast of someone who feels entirely secure in his good fortune. None of this lavish security was an accident, because keeping a friendly local king in luxurious comfort was not Roman generosity. It was Roman strategy, and a famously shrewd one. Garrisoning a restless province with legions was ruinously expensive and endlessly troublesome, whereas a well-rewarded native ruler who governed his own people on Rome's behalf cost almost nothing, and absorbed all the local resentment himself. You handed a cooperative chieftain citizenship, wealth, fine titles, and the means to live like royalty, and in return he kept his people in line and the taxes flowing, a sort of franchise arrangement in which the local manager got rich so long as he kept the parent company happy. Fishbourne is what that arrangement looked like when it was working beautifully, the gleaming reward handed to a man who had read the political weather correctly and bet everything on the winning side. So who lived in this monument to conspicuous consumption, this country house grander than anything most Romans back home would ever set foot in? The obvious assumption, the one that fits the conquest fairy tale, is that it must have belonged to some high-ranking Roman official, a governor or a general, planted there to lord it over the subdued locals from a suitably imposing headquarters. But the evidence points somewhere far more interesting. Among the finds recovered from the site is a gold ring, and an inscription on it preserves a name, Tiberius Claudius Catuarus, a name that tells a small but revealing story all by itself. The first two parts, Tiberius Claudius, are thoroughly Roman, the kind of imperial names a man would take on when he became a Roman citizen, very often borrowed from the emperor who granted him the honour. But the last part, Catuarus, is unmistakably native, a good solid British name. Here, in a single ring, is the whole arrangement in miniature, a local man who had become a Roman citizen without ceasing to be a Briton, wearing both identities at once on his own hand. Alongside such finds came the sort of refined ornament you would expect in a thoroughly cultured household, including a delicate marble bust of a child, the sort of sentimental luxury that speaks of a settled, wealthy family rather than a temporary military posting. Put it all together, and the most persuasive answer is that the master of Fishbourne was not a Roman administrator at all, but a Briton, a local ruler raised up and richly rewarded for his loyalty, a client king of the realm. The name most often connected with this glittering household is Togodubnus, a native British leader who threw in his lot with Rome and was repaid on a truly spectacular scale, given the wealth, the citizenship, and the architectural means to live like an emperor in his own homeland. And once you see Fishbourne in that light, its whole meaning flips inside out. It stops being a symbol of Roman boots on British necks and becomes something far more telling, a monument not to conquest but to collaboration, to the comfortable, profitable partnership between Rome and the native elite who were only too happy to come aboard. It is the architectural equivalent of that Colchester medallion, the same message written in 160 columns instead of a single silver disc, the proud declaration of a local power broker who had bet on Rome and won big, which leaves the old playground story of plucky natives crushed by ruthless invaders looking rather threadbare. The reality is so much stranger and more human. A divided land of squabbling kingdoms, some of them Rome's eager trading partners for generations. A deposed king begging a foreign emperor for help. An invasion that arrived, at least in part, as a favour to a friend. And in its wake, not a subjugated wasteland, but a native aristocrat living in a palace stuffed with imported luxury, wearing his Roman citizenship and his British name with equal pride. Rome did not so much smash its way into Britain as get invited in, talked up, and made comfortable by the very people it is supposed to have flattened, and the grandest building in the whole country stands as a 100-ton monument to that awkward truth. The conquest, like the collapse we started with, turns out to be far less a tale of darkness descending or order arriving than a story of locals making deals, picking winners, and getting on with the business of living, which, as we're about to see again and again, is the one thing the people of this island have always been remarkably good at. That same talent for absorbing rather than discarding shows up nowhere more clearly than in the one corner of life you might expect a conquering empire to trample hardest, which is religion. We tend to imagine conquerors arriving with the firm intention of stamping out the local gods, toppling the old shrines, and installing their own deities in the rubble, the way you might gut a building and put up a competitor's signage. Rome, for the most part, did nothing of the kind. Rome looked at the gods it found in Britain, and, with the cool pragmatism of a corporation eyeing a profitable rival, decided not to destroy them but to take them over, rebrand them, and quietly fold them into the family. And the single best place to watch this happen, the showroom for the whole operation, sits steaming gently in the west of the country at Bath. To understand why the Romans went to so much trouble there, you have to understand what they were actually looking at, because Bath is genuinely strange, even today. Out of the ground, with no help from anybody, comes a torrent of water at a steady 40+ degrees, something in the order of 250,000 gallons of it every single day, hot enough to bathe in and pouring out with no visible source of heat. Now place that miracle in the context of ancient Britain, a country whose chief contributions to the human experience have always included grey skies, persistent drizzle, and a damp chill that gets into the bones. In a land like that, a place where hot water simply rises from the earth of its own accord, endlessly, for free, was not a pleasant amenity. It was a wonder, the kind of thing that demands an explanation, and in a world without geology textbooks, the only explanation available was a divine one. Something powerful clearly lived down there, and you would be wise to stay on its good side. So people did, and they had been doing so for an extraordinarily long time before any Roman ever set eyes on the spring. This was not a Roman holy site that the Romans built. The reverence at Bath reaches back into the deep prehistoric past, with signs that the place drew worshippers thousands of years earlier, in the Mesolithic, around the 7th millennium before Christ. We are talking about a sacred reputation already older to the Romans than the Romans are to us, a holiness so ancient it had practically fossilized. By the time the legions arrived, this was not a fresh opportunity to plant a flag. It was a venerable institution with a customer base going back beyond memory, and the Romans, being nothing if not commercially minded, recognized exactly what they had stumbled onto. What they did next is the whole lesson in miniature. Thanks to the meticulous excavations carried out at Bath in the 1970s by the archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, we can see that the Romans did not wait around politely before getting involved. Within roughly 30 years of the conquest, a remarkably short turnaround for a building project on the far edge of the empire, they had moved in and done what Romans did best, which was to take something natural and slightly chaotic and wrap it in engineering. They enclosed the bubbling spring, contained the flow, built a grand reservoir and a temple complex around it, and turned a wild sacred pool into a monumental religious site, all stone and order and impressive architecture. To a casual observer it might look like a takeover, the empire stamping its own grandeur over a primitive local shrine. But look closer at what they actually worshipped there, and the takeover reveals itself as something far cleverer. Because the Romans did not march in and announce that the old goddess of the spring was finished, and that one of their own deities would be moving into her premises. They did something much more diplomatic. The spring already belonged to a local goddess named Sulis, a native British divinity with a long and loyal following. Rome, rather than evicting her, simply introduced her to one of their own, the goddess Minerva, decided the two had a great deal in common, and merged them into a single combined deity, Sulis Minerva, worshipped under both names at once. It was in effect a corporate merger of the divine, the local brand and the imperial brand fused into one product, so that absolutely nobody had to feel their god had been cancelled. The worshippers who had been coming to Sulis for generations could keep coming, keep their goddess, and keep their rituals, while the new Roman arrivals could feel perfectly at home praying to a figure who was reassuringly Minerva. Two faiths, one spring, everybody satisfied, which is a far smarter way to run an empire than smashing things and making enemies, and considerably cheaper too. This pairing off of a local god with a Roman one was not a happy improvisation dreamed up on the spot at a single British spring. It was a tried and tested instrument of imperial management, used across the entire Roman world, so habitual that it amounted to policy. Wherever the empire spread, its administrators would size up the gods they encountered, decide which member of their own crowded pantheon each one most resembled, and quietly file the local deity under that familiar Roman name, the way a global company entering a new market rebrands a beloved regional product, rather than trying to wipe it out. A god of war here, a goddess of healing there, each one matched to its nearest Roman counterpart and absorbed without fuss. The combined goddess of the Western Spring is simply the clearest and best preserved British example of a technique Rome practiced from one end of its territory to the other, and it worked precisely because it asked nobody to give anything up. You did not lose your god. You merely discovered, to your apparent relief, that your god had been a Roman one all along. The blending went deeper than the name. The decoration of the temple itself carried meanings that ran straight back into the older British way of seeing the world. The great pediment and the imagery around the sacred complex set divine figures in deliberate pairs and oppositions, a goddess associated with the moon and a god associated with the sun placed in balance with one another. This was not random ornament. It echoed something the people of the island had felt for a very long time, a sense that the world ran on the balance of opposites, the feminine set against the masculine, the cold against the heat, the north against the south, the moon against the sun, each needing the other to keep things in their proper order. The Romans, with their flair for presentation, gave this ancient instinct a polished classical face, but the instinct itself was homegrown, and they had the good sense not to argue with it. They wrapped the old idea in new marble and let it carry on doing its job. Anyone who has stood before the surviving stonework of that temple knows the most arresting piece of it. A great carved face that once glared out from high on the pediment, fierce and wide-eyed, framed by a wild mane of hair and beard that seems to writhe outward like flames, or like water, or perhaps deliberately like both at once. Scholars have argued about that face for well over a century and never quite settled it, which is rather the point. It carries the swept-back ferocity the classical world gave to certain terrifying mythological figures, yet it is unmistakably male, sun-like, and watery all at the same time, the very embodiment of those balanced opposites the temple was built to honour. It is, in stone, exactly the thing this whole site represents. A classical Roman technique pressed into the service of a thoroughly British idea, the two so thoroughly fused that even now nobody can fully untangle where one ends and the other begins. Whoever carved it was not copying a manual. They were translating something local into a language the wider empire could read. Around this sacred core the Romans built something that blurred the line between temple and resort, because they were never ones to let a perfectly good miracle go unmonetized. Beside the spring rose a complex of bathing halls fed by the hot water. Great pools lined with sheets of lead to hold the warmth, fed and drained by plumbing so well made that parts of it still carry water to this day, well over a millennium and a half after the engineers who laid it down went to their graves. The place became a destination, a draw for visitors from across the province and beyond, people who came partly to worship and partly to soak their aching joints in the only naturally hot water in the country. Pilgrimage and spa break rolled into one, which is a combination the modern wellness industry likes to imagine it invented and very much did not. They came hoping to be healed, to be blessed, to be seen, and to enjoy a genuinely warm bath in a land that offered preciously few of them. And while they were there, in the steam and the prayer and the gentle social bustle, they did what visitors to a holy place have always done. They left something behind for the goddess. And then there is the water itself, which had one final trick that no amount of theology could have improved upon. The spring at Bath is rich in iron, and where that water met the dark mud and stone around the source, it stained everything a deep rusty red. Imagine standing there in the steam, watching hot water surge up from the depths of the earth, and seeing the ground around it turn the unmistakable colour of blood. To an ancient worshipper this was not a quaint mineral curiosity. It looked for all the world as though the earth itself was bleeding, as though the spring were a living wound in the body of the world from which warmth and water poured eternally. You could scarcely design a more powerful advertisement for the sacredness of a place. The site did the work of convincing people all by itself, and the priests, one imagines, hardly had to lift a finger. We do, of course, now know the rather less dramatic truth about where all the hot water comes from, and it is worth a brief pause simply for the contrast. The rain that falls on the surrounding hills soaks down through the rock to enormous depths, where the heat of the earth itself warms it over a span of thousands of years, before pressure drives it back up to the surface, picking up its load of minerals and iron along the way. So the water steaming out of the ground at Bath today is, in a sense, rainfall that landed back when people were still depositing offerings in the spring, finally completing its slow underground journey. Knowing the plumbing, unfortunately, does very little to dispel the magic. Stand beside that surging hot spring on a cold grey morning, watch the steam rise and the red stain spread, and try telling yourself it is merely heated rainwater on a long commute. The ancient worshippers, lacking the textbook, simply trusted their eyes, and their eyes told them they were standing at the edge of something alive. People did not come to a place like that empty-handed, And here we arrive at a habit that is going to matter enormously in a moment. Worshippers at the spring gave things to the water. They dropped offerings into it, coins by the thousand, small valuables, personal items, anything that might please the goddess or carry a prayer down to her. Some of what went in was darker in spirit. Little written pleas asking the goddess to punish whoever had wronged the giver. The ancient equivalent of leaving a furious review and trusting the management to handle it. These were scratched onto thin sheets of metal and dropped into the water as petitions, and the surviving examples are oddly endearing in their pettiness. The grievances they record are not the stuff of epic poetry. They are complaints about stolen cloaks, pilfered coins, missing bath towels, and the everyday thefts that plagued anyone foolish enough to leave their belongings unattended while soaking, each one demanding that the goddess track down the culprit and visit some satisfying misfortune upon them. It is a strangely comforting glimpse of human nature, the discovery that 2,000 years ago people were already convinced the universe ought to take a personal interest in the recovery of their stolen towels. But behind the small-mindedness sat a serious conviction. The underlying logic was always the same. The water was a doorway to the divine, and the way you reached through that doorway was to give something precious to it, to let it sink out of human hands and into the keeping of the powers below. Hold on to that idea. The deliberate gift dropped into sacred water, because we are about to find it again, on a far grander and far more famous scale, with a blade instead of a coin. There is a fitting postscript to the spring itself, because Bath shows us in one place what happened to so much of Roman Britain after the legion sailed off. The elaborate engineering did not last forever. Without the empire to maintain the drains and tend the masonry, the great bathing complex gradually clogged, flooded, and slid into disrepair, the neat pools choking with mud and the proud halls falling quiet. To a casual eye that looks like exactly the decline the gloomy textbooks promised, but the sacredness, the thing that had drawn people there for thousands of years, did not drain away with the bathwater. The site stayed holy. In time, a great Christian church would rise on the very same ground, the new faith planting itself on the old sacred spot just as it did along the river valleys, and the place remains a centre of pilgrimage and wonder to this very day. The plumbing failed, the holiness did not, and that distinction between the machinery that needed Rome and the belief that never did is the whole point. The conclusion to draw from Bath is the one that quietly undermines the whole legend of darkness. Rome did not erase the spiritual map of Britain, it inherited it. The empire took possession of the island's sacred geography, its holy springs and revered places, and rather than wiping them out, it occupied them, renamed them, and dressed them up, leaving the underlying devotion fully intact beneath the new architecture. The gods of Britain were not killed. They were given Roman surnames and a better building, and they carried on, which means that when Rome eventually withdrew, as we know it did, the sacredness it had borrowed did not pack up and leave with the legions. It had been there long before them, and it would outlast them, and that stubborn persistence is exactly what turns a forgotten ritual into the most beloved legend in British history. To see that happen, we have to leave the warm steam of Bath and head east, to the flat, watery country of Lincolnshire, and to a discovery that reaches back even further into the strange relationship between this island and its rivers. The habit of giving things to water, the one we just watched at the spring, was not a local peculiarity of one hot pool in the west. It was ancient, it was widespread, and in some places it was practiced not with coins but with weapons, which is where the story of a certain very famous sword actually begins, long before anyone dreamed up the king who would one day be said to carry it. In 1981, in the valley of the River Witham, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a wooden causeway, a built timber walkway running out across the wet ground toward the water, and this was no recent garden path. The structure was more than 2,000 years old, but the truly arresting part was not the causeway itself. It was what lay scattered along and around it, because the mud had been hiding a small arsenal. Dozens of swords and spears had been recovered from the valley, weapons that had ended up in the water and stayed there, swallowed by the soft ground and preserved for millennia. And these were only the latest additions to a haul that had been accumulating in the records for a very long time, because the wet, boggy fenlands of this part of England have a remarkable talent for keeping things, sealing organic material away from the air that would normally rot it to nothing. The story of how all this came to light owes a surprising amount to drainage, of all the unromantic subjects. From the late 18th century, as the great wet fens of eastern England were being systematically drained and converted into farmland, The digging began turning up objects, and fortunately for us somebody was paying attention. The naturalist Joseph Banks, a man with the resources and the curiosity to care, gave instructions that finds emerging from the drainage work should be saved rather than tossed aside as junk, and thanks in part to that early foresight, the fens have since yielded hundreds of objects, a span of human deposits running all the way from the deep prehistoric past right up to the 14th century. That is an astonishing range. We are not looking at a single event or a one-off accident, somebody's unlucky day with a dropped sword. We are looking at a practice that went on and on, generation after generation, century after century, an unbroken tradition of putting precious things into the water deliberately over a stretch of time so long it defies easy comprehension. It also helps to understand just how the wet ground managed to hand all this back to us in the first place, because under normal circumstances metal corrodes, wood rots, and the past quietly dissolves into the soil. The fenlands break that rule. Waterlogged ground starves the buried objects of the oxygen that decay depends on, sealing them in a kind of cold, airless time capsule that can preserve wood, leather, and worked metal for thousands of years in a state that would be impossible on dry land. That is why these valleys keep surrendering things that ought, by rights, to have vanished long ago, and why some of the objects pulled from such waters across Britain are not battered scraps, but breathtaking pieces of art. The Witham itself gave up a magnificent decorated shield, a masterwork of Iron Age metalcraft so finely made and so elegantly ornamented that it could never have been a humble tool of battle. An object like that was a statement, a treasure, the kind of thing a person commissioned to display wealth and standing, which makes its presence at the bottom of a river all the more telling. Nobody crafts a parade-grade showpiece and then loses it overboard by accident. It went into the water because it was meant to, and that intention is the whole story. And that is the key word, deliberately. It would be easy and comforting to assume these weapons simply fell in, lost in skirmishes or dropped from boats by careless owners. But the sheer quantity, the consistency, and above all the value of what went into the water rule that out. Nobody loses dozens of fine swords by accident in the same stretch of river over centuries. These were offerings, given on purpose, and the logic behind them is the same one we met at the spring, only intensified. To give a weapon to the water was not to throw it away. It was to return it, to hand the most valuable and the most personal object a person could own into the keeping of the powers that lived beneath the surface. A sword was not loose change. It represented enormous labour, real wealth, status, and very likely the identity of the warrior who carried it. To surrender something like that to the depths was an act of profound seriousness, the ultimate gift, and the people of this island made that gift again and again for thousands of years. Nor was this the private obsession of one damp Lincolnshire valley. The same instinct turns up wherever the ground in Britain holds water and gives back its secrets. Rivers across the country have surrendered weapons and fine metalwork in startling numbers, and one of the most spectacular hauls of all came from a small, unremarkable stretch of water on the island of Anglesey, far away in the northwest, where a wartime project to extend an airfield disturbed the boggy ground and brought up a treasure trove of the Iron Age. Out of that one modest pool came a great mass of deposited objects, swords and spearheads, fittings from chariots, ornaments, and the iron chains used to bind captives, a whole inventory of the most valuable and the most meaningful things a community could possess, all given over to the water in the same spirit as the swords of the Witham. When the identical practice appears at opposite ends of the country, carried out by people who never met and may never even have heard of one another, you're no longer looking at a local quirk. You're looking at a shared way of understanding the world, a belief that ran through the whole island and across the water into the wider ancient world beyond. The conviction that the surface of a pool was a frontier, and that the proper way to honour the powers on the far side was to send your finest things across it. There is an idea here, suggested by the archaeologist Francis Pryor, that pulls this practice into even sharper and more haunting focus, and it has to do with how these weapons were made in the first place. Think about the casting of a blade in the Age of Bronze. Molten metal, glowing and liquid, is poured into a mould of stone or clay and left to cool, and when it has set hard, the finished sword is drawn out of that mould, lifted out of the very stone that shaped it. Pull a sword from a stone. Read that again and let it land, because the most famous image in the entire Arthurian legend, the blade drawn from the rock that marks out the true king, may be nothing more or less than a distant memory of the foundry, a poetic echo of the genuinely magical seeming process by which ancient smiths conjured gleaming weapons out of solid stone. The sword in the stone was not invented by medieval romancers out of thin air. It may be the folk memory of a workshop dressed up over the centuries into a miracle. It helps to remember just how uncanny the work of a smith genuinely was to the people of that age. Most crafts you could more or less understand by watching them, but metalworking looked like sorcery. A person took dull lumps of rock and earth, subjected them to roaring heat, and out of that violence drew shining, ringing, deadly blades that could outlast the men who wielded them. To a community with no notion of chemistry, the smith was not a tradesman. He was something closer to a magician, a figure who commanded fire and transformation, and stood with 1 foot in the ordinary world and 1 foot somewhere stranger, which is exactly why the makers of legend so often gave their enchanted weapons mysterious or otherworldly origins. And the same instinct that made fire and forge feel like a threshold made water feel like one too. Springs, rivers, lakes, and bogs were the places where the solid world gave way to something you could not walk on, and could not see the bottom of, edges between the known and the unknown. Giving a treasure to such a place was not discarding it into mud. It was passing it across a boundary, out of the human world and into the keeping of whatever lay on the other side, and a blade forged by near magic was the most fitting gift of all to send across that line. And crucially, the arrival of Rome did not interrupt any of this. We have already seen how the empire handled the sacred spring in the west, moving in, rebranding, and leaving the underlying devotion fully alive beneath the new stonework. The wild water cult of the rivers and bogs got much the same treatment, which is to say almost no treatment at all. The objects pulled from these waters do not stop at the moment the legions land and resume only after they leave. They run right through the Roman centuries without missing a beat, the old practice continuing quietly alongside all the marble and the mosaics, as though the empire had simply shrugged and decided this particular habit was none of its business. The grand official religion of Rome occupied the showpiece sites and put its name on the temples, while down in the reeds and the mud the far older rite carried on undisturbed, generation after generation, exactly as it always had. So by the time the legions finally withdrew, this belief was in no danger whatsoever of leaving with them. It had survived their arrival without flinching, and it would survive their departure just as easily, because it had never really belonged to Rome in the first place. Now watch what happened to all this when Christianity arrived, because if any force was going to sweep away an old pagan obsession with throwing weapons into rivers, surely it was the new faith with its churches and its single God. And here is the genuinely lovely twist. It did not. Along a single stretch of the Witham Valley, roughly 10 miles of it, there once stood 14 abbeys, a remarkable concentration of Christian houses for one short ribbon of riverside. And these abbeys were not scattered at random across the landscape. Each one of them sat at the end of one of those ancient causeways, the old timber walkways that led down to the sacred water. The Christian holy houses had planted themselves precisely on top of the pagan holy places, at the ends of the very paths that had carried offerings to the river for centuries. The new religion did not bulldoze the old sacred geography any more than Rome had. It moved in, just as Rome moved in at the spring, and kept the holy places holy under fresh management. The water still mattered. Only the explanation for why it mattered had changed. The memory of all this is even buried in the names on the map if you know how to listen for it. The city of Lincoln, the great settlement of this region, takes its name from an older word, linden, which carries the meaning of a pool or a lake, a town defined by its sacred water from its very beginnings. And the old language of the island preserved a word, Nikor, for a spirit or monster that dwelt in the water, a supernatural presence beneath the surface of every pool and river. The watery world, in other words, was understood to be inhabited, alive with powers and presences, a realm where the divine could be reached if you approached it correctly and gave it its due. The landscape itself was speaking, and what it kept saying, in its place names and its drowned swords and its causeways, was that the water was a doorway to another world. And here is the part that ought to give anyone pause, because this instinct never actually went away. It only grew tamer. The countryside of Britain is still dotted with holy wells, hundreds of them, springs that picked up the names of saints once the old gods had been retired, places where the sick once came to dip a cloth or drop a pin in hope of a cure, the pagan habit politely rebranded for a Christian audience. and the gentlest descendant of all sits in practically every town square and shopping centre in the modern world, because every time someone fishes a coin out of a pocket, makes a silent wish, and tosses it into a fountain, they are performing, without the faintest idea of it, the very same rite the worshippers at the spring performed 2,000 years ago. The water, the wish, the offering surrendered to the depths, all of it survives, worn smooth and harmless by the centuries, but unmistakably the same gesture. We have simply forgotten that we're doing it, which is rather the fate of most ancient things, to carry on quietly long after everyone has stopped noticing why. It is worth pausing on how a story like that actually comes together, because legends are not so much written as gathered. Over the long centuries, the deep folk memories we have been tracing, the blade drawn from the stone of its mould, the precious weapon owed back to the depths, the pool as a threshold to another world, did not simply evaporate once people lost the ability to explain where they came from. They lingered in the imagination as half-understood images, too resonant to forget and too old to account for, drifting free of their original meaning. And when the storytellers of a later age set out to build the towering legend of a once and future king, they reached, as storytellers always do, for the most powerful raw materials lying around, and these ancient water images were among the most powerful of all. The legend gathered them up like a magnet rolling through iron filings, binding 1,000 years of scattered belief onto the figure of one named hero. Arthur, in that sense, did not invent these images. He inherited them, the final and most famous owner of a sword that the people of this island had been giving to the water, since long before anyone thought to write his name. So when the great legend finally crystallized, the tale of a king whose sword comes from the water and must, at the end, be returned to it, of a mysterious arm rising from the surface of a lake to receive a blade back into the deep, none of that was the invention of a bored medieval storyteller reaching for something magical. It was the fossil of something real, the surviving shape of a belief that this island had held for thousands of years, that the most precious thing a person could own belonged ultimately to the water and must in time be given back to it. The Lady of the Lake is not fantasy bolted onto history. She is the memory of a genuine and ancient devotion, one that the spring at Bath shows us in its earliest form, and the Witham Valley shows us carried on through Rome, through Christianity, and into legend. The sword given to the water is older than Arthur, older than Rome, older very nearly than anything else in the story, and it survived every change of empire and every change of faith for one simple reason. The people of this island never stopped believing the water was listening, and on that point at least the legend tells the plain truth. The old water religion was one faith among many, ancient and stubborn and perfectly capable of looking after itself. But while it carried on quietly down in the reeds, a brand new religion was sweeping across the entire Roman world, and the comforting story that Britain sat out on the damp edge of things, ignored and abandoned while the great dramas of history happened somewhere warmer, falls apart the moment you look at where this new faith took root. Far from being left out, Britain was very nearly at the centre of the action, and the religious upheaval that followed was not some quiet provincial affair. It was a full-blown convulsion of the kind that shakes empires, and the island felt every tremor of it. To see just how central Britain was, you only have to go to the city the Romans called Iberacum, which we know today as York. In the year 306, in that very city, a soldier named Constantine was hailed as emperor by the troops, and this was no minor backwater promotion soon forgotten. This was Constantine the Great, the man who would go on to reshape the entire spiritual life of the Roman world by throwing the weight of the empire behind Christianity, taking it from a persecuted minority faith to the favoured religion of the most powerful state on earth. And the place where his road to power began, the spot where the soldiers first put the imperial title on him, was a city in northern Britain. So when people tell you the island was a forgotten margin, where nothing of consequence ever happened, you may gently remind them that the emperor who Christianized Rome was proclaimed on British soil. That is not the resume of an afterthought. It is worth dwelling on just how that moment came about, because the circumstances make Britain's place at the heart of things even harder to wave away. Constantine had come to the province with his father, who was himself one of the senior rulers of the empire, and it was at York that the father fell ill and died. In the raw, dangerous politics of the late Roman world, the death of an emperor was the cue for everyone with ambitions to start sharpening them, and the army stationed in Britain wasted no time in acclaiming the dead man's son as his successor on the spot. So the launching pad for one of the most consequential reigns in all of European history was a fortress city in the north of England, not some glittering palace in the Mediterranean sun. From that British beginning, Constantine fought his way to sole power and then used it to transform Christianity's fortunes utterly, granting it official toleration and lending it the prestige of the throne, before calling the great councils that would hammer out what Christians were actually supposed to believe. The faith that would define the next 1,000 years of Europe got its decisive political boost from a man the British legions had made, which is a rather large thing to have happen in a province we are repeatedly told nobody cared about. The ordinary people of the province took up the new faith too, and we can prove it because they left their mark in a wonderfully tangible form. Across Britain, archaeologists have turned up large lead tanks, heavy vessels stamped or scratched with a particular symbol, 2 Greek letters laid one over the other to form the monogram of Christ, the sign we call the Chi. It looks a little like a capital P with an X drawn through its stem, and to anyone in the late Roman world it was instantly recognisable, the early Christian equivalent of a logo, a badge of belonging splashed across the objects of the faithful. These tanks were almost certainly used for baptism, the central rite of joining the community, which means we are not dealing with a handful of eccentric converts huddled in secret. We're dealing with organised congregations, with people who needed proper equipment for their ceremonies, and who advertised their allegiance openly on the metalwork. Christianity in Britain was not a rumour. It had plumbing, congregations, and the everyday hardware of a faith that had settled in to stay. Higher up the social ladder, the wealthy embraced the new religion as well, though in a manner that can only be described as keeping their options open. The great country estates of Roman Britain, the villas, were the homes of an elite who had grown comfortable and cultured, and some of them were spectacularly grand. Take Chedworth, which counts among the 10 richest houses ever found in the province, a sprawling residence with a single corridor running close to 80 metres, long enough that you would want a good reason before walking from one end to the other. Or take Lullingstone, another fine villa, where the spiritual arrangements of the owners are preserved in a way that tells you everything about the religious mood of the age. Because in these houses the brand new faith of Christ did not sweep away the old gods and heroes of classical mythology. It moved in alongside them. The same household that maintained a Christian place of worship would decorate its floors with scenes from pagan legend, the 2 belief systems coexisting under one expensive roof. This was not confusion or hypocrisy, so much as a sensible reluctance to put all of one's eternal eggs in a single basket. When you're unsure which version of the afterlife is the correct one, the prudent move, naturally, is to leave the door open to both. Lullingstone makes this hedging spectacularly literal, because the layering of beliefs there was not just side by side, but stacked one on top of the other. In the same house, on an upper level, the owners maintained a Christian room decorated with painted figures standing with their arms raised in prayer and marked with the sign of Christ, a genuine little house of worship built into a private home, and below it, on a lower level, sat an older shrine of an entirely different character, devoted to the watery spirits of the classical world, the kind of damp, mysterious cult we have already met in this island's long love affair with springs and pools. So under one roof you had the new faith literally sitting on top of the old, the family apparently content to keep both in working order, just in case. It is the architecture of someone who has read the spiritual fine print very carefully and concluded that the wisest policy is full coverage. One imagines the household moving between the two with the unbothered ease of people who saw no reason to cancel a perfectly good insurance policy, simply because they had taken out a new one. And here is where it gets genuinely strange and fascinating, because the imagery on some of these villa floors is not the straightforward Christianity you might expect. The archaeologist Dominic Perring, studying the elaborate mosaics, has argued that what we are looking at is something far more mystical and secretive than ordinary worship, a strand of thought known as Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is one of those ideas that takes a moment to get your head around, so let's keep it simple. At its heart sat the conviction that the physical world, this world of bodies and matter and everyday life, was not a good creation at all, but a kind of prison, a trap into which the soul had fallen and from which it longed to escape. Salvation, in this view, came not through ordinary faith but through gnosis, through secret knowledge, a hidden understanding available only to initiates, the spiritual equivalent of a members-only club with a very exclusive door policy. And the way you signalled these ideas, to those who could read them, was through coded imagery. Look at the mosaics with that key in hand and the pictures start to speak. A favourite image is a hero mounted on a winged horse, a flying steed soaring up into the sky, the warrior striking down a monster below. To casual eyes it is just a handsome scene from old legend, a bit of classical decoration. But read through the Gnostic lens, it becomes a coded map of the soul's whole journey. The hero representing the spirit, the monster representing the evil and corruption of the material prison, and the winged horse carrying the victorious soul up and away, out of the trap of the world and into immortality. The floor you walked across at dinner was, in effect, a quiet sermon about escaping the flesh, intelligible only to those who'd been let in on the secret. It was theology disguised as interior decorating, which you have to admit is a considerably more interesting use of a mosaic than most of us manage with our flooring today. It is not hard to see why this particular flavour of belief found such a welcome among the wealthy of late Roman Britain, and the reason is almost poignant. Here was a faith built around the idea that the visible material world was a failing trap from which the wise soul longed to escape, and it took hold precisely as the visible material world these people knew, the comfortable, orderly empire that had made their villas and their fortunes possible, was beginning to wobble on its foundations. When the solid certainties of your age start to crack, a spiritual outlook that tells you the physical realm was never your true home in the first place, that the real prize lies in transcending all of it, becomes deeply consoling. The richest and most cultured Britons, the very people with the most to lose as the old order frayed, were drawn to a creed that promised the soul could rise above the wreckage altogether and fly free of a world that was letting them down. Their beautiful coded floors were, in a sense, a quiet form of insurance against the dawning suspicion that the good times were not going to last. And on that particular point their instincts turned out to be uncomfortably accurate. This delicate, secretive, do-it-yourself spirituality flourished for a while, and then the empire decided it had had quite enough of people improvising their own paths to heaven. In the year 380, the imperial authorities came down firmly on the side of a single official version of Christianity, the orthodox, organised, top-down kind, and everything that strayed from it, including the mystical Gnostic strand, was branded as heresy, forbidden and condemned. What followed across Britain was a wave of what we can only call decommissioning, and it is one of the eeriest things in the whole archaeological record. The sacred objects of the now forbidden practices were not simply set aside or forgotten, they were deliberately destroyed. Baptismal fonts were broken apart, the great lead tanks with their proud Chi-Rho symbols were chopped up, and the pieces were thrown down wells, ritually killed and disposed of, the religious equivalent of wiping a hard drive and snapping it in half so that nobody could ever recover what had been on it. Someone went to real trouble to make sure these things could never be used again. But destruction was not the only response, and the other one tells you even more about the mood of the country. All across the province people began burying their treasures, hoards of fine church silver and humbler pewter, tucked into the ground and hidden in numbers that speak of something close to panic. Now people bury valuables for one reason above all others, which is that they no longer trust the world above ground to keep them safe, and they intend to come back for them when things calm down. The presence of so many buried hoards is therefore not a sign of a peaceful, contented province. It is a sign of fear, of anger, of communities hiding what they cherished from an authority they had stopped believing in. And the people who buried these things, in many cases, never did come back for them, which is precisely why we find them still in the ground today, faithful little time capsules of a moment when ordinary Britons decided that the safest place for their most precious possessions was underground and out of sight. One such buried hoard deserves a special mention because it ranks among the most remarkable Christian finds anywhere in the entire Roman Empire. Discovered in the east of England, it was a collection of early church silver, gleaming vessels and delicate votive plaques, thin sheets of silver pledged to God in thanks or in hope, some of them marked with that now familiar monogram of Christ. What makes it so striking is its age and its completeness. A working set of liturgical treasure used by a real congregation, hidden away in the troubled late years of Roman Britain and never reclaimed. This was not the property of a lone believer. It was the wealth of an organised, confident, well-equipped Christian community, exactly the kind the standard story has trouble accommodating, buried in fear at the very moment that story claims the island was lapsing into a faithless, formless dark. And there is a quiet irony in the disposal of so much of this sacred metal. because whether it was hidden church plate or the deliberately broken fonts and tanks of the forbidden cults, a great deal of it ended up in the ground or down a well, returned to the earth and the water exactly as this island had always returned its most valued things. Even in their fear and their fury, the people of Britain reached, perhaps without thinking, for the oldest instinct they had. Put the broken fonts and the buried silver together, and a picture emerges that demolishes the lazy story of an island gently abandoned and left to fade. Britain in these decades was not asleep. It was in turmoil, gripped by exactly the same fierce arguments over faith, authority, and orthodoxy that were convulsing the whole Roman world, fighting over the deepest questions a person can fight over. And crucially, the authority doing the forbidding, the smashing, and the dictating of correct belief was Rome itself. By the time these treasures were going into the ground and these sacred objects were being hacked apart, the empire was already losing something far more important than territory. It was losing the hearts and minds of the people it claimed to govern. The spiritual bond was fraying well before the political one snapped. When the formal break with Rome finally came, it did not fall on a loyal and grateful population suddenly cast adrift. It fell on a people who had already, in the most intimate matters of belief and trust, begun to pull away. The divorce, when it came, had been a long time brewing. If anything, Britain was not merely caught up in the empire's religious storms, but generating them. The island produced at least one homegrown thinker whose ideas about free will, sin, and whether human beings could perfect themselves through their own effort lit a theological bonfire that raged across the whole Roman world and drew furious responses from the most famous churchmen of the age. This was not the work of an isolated backward province mumbling half-remembered prayers in the dark. It was the work of a place confident and learned enough to challenge the central doctrines of the faith and force the rest of Christendom to argue back. The dispute grew serious enough that the Continental Church eventually felt obliged to dispatch a senior bishop across the Channel, specifically to win the Britons round and stamp the troublesome teaching out, which is not a thing you do to a population that has ceased to matter. You do not send your best debater to argue with the dead. You send him because the living are winning the argument, and that, more than any pot or coin, tells you how intellectually alive this supposedly darkening island really was. Which raises the obvious question, because if the province was lively enough to tear itself apart over theology, lively enough to organise congregations and hide treasure and smash heretical fonts, then it was lively, full stop. A dead society does not argue about the nature of the soul. And that liveliness brings us to the very thing the gloomy textbooks insisted died first, and most completely after the legions left, the thing that was supposed to be the clearest proof of all that the lights had gone out, the cities. The story we inherited is brutally simple. After the year 410, the towns of Roman Britain emptied out, the buildings crumbled, the streets fell silent, and urban life, that great achievement of Roman civilization, simply ceased to exist. The Victorians who wandered the picturesque ruins of the old Roman cities felt this in their bones. They strolled among the broken columns and tumbled walls, sketched the romantic desolation, and concluded that what they were looking at was the corpse of a civilization, a once great town reduced to a quarry for sheep to graze among. It made for a melancholy and rather beautiful image. It was also, as the digging would eventually reveal, almost entirely wrong. The place that blew the story open sits in the quiet countryside of the west, a site the Romans called Viriconium, and which we now know as Wroxeter. In its heyday, this was one of the largest cities in all of Roman Britain, a substantial place with all the trappings of urban life, and for centuries the visible remains, the standing fragments of masonry that drew the romantic sightseers, seemed to confirm the tale of decline and abandonment perfectly. But in the 1980s, careful excavation beneath and around those admired ruins turned the whole picture inside out, because what the archaeologists found was not the rubble of a dying town. It was a building site. Finding it at all was a triumph of patience, and it is worth understanding why, because it explains how something this large could hide in plain sight for so long. The man who led the work, the archaeologist Philip Barker, was a pioneer of a painstaking method suited to exactly this kind of nearly invisible evidence. Stone buildings are easy. They leave walls, foundations, obvious lumps of masonry that announce themselves to anyone with a shovel. But a building made largely of timber leaves almost nothing once the wood has rotted away. Only the faintest ghosts in the soil, subtle changes in colour and texture where posts once stood and beams once rested. traces so delicate that a careless or hurried excavation will scrape straight through them without ever noticing they were there. Barker developed a way of peeling back the ground in broad, gentle layers and reading these whispers in the dirt, and it was this slow, almost reverent approach that revealed a major 6th century building where earlier generations, hacking down through the site in search of solid Roman stone, had seen only meaningless disturbance. The late life of the city had not been missing from the ground. It had simply been written in an alphabet that nobody had yet bothered to learn how to read. What lay there was the trace of an enormous structure, and it had not collapsed so much as been carefully and deliberately put up. The builders had first laid down a great platform of rammed rubble, a properly engineered foundation, level and solid, designed to bear the weight of a large timber-framed building raised on top of it. This was not the desperate improvisation of frightened survivors, throwing together a shelter from whatever lay around. It was planned, skilled, ambitious construction, the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had the organisation and resources to do it on a grand scale. And then came the detail that genuinely stunned the people who uncovered it, the dating. This building did not belong to the twilight of Roman Britain, to the years just before or after the legions left. It went up around the years 520 to somewhere near 590 or 600, which is to say a full century after the date the textbooks gave for the official death of Roman Britain. 100 years after the lights were supposed to have gone out, someone in this so-called dead city was commissioning a major expertly built structure. And it was not built in some new, alien style. It was raised using Roman units of measurement, laid out with Roman methods, conceived in a thoroughly Roman way of thinking about space and proportion. Whoever designed it was working from the same mental blueprint a Roman architect would have used, long after Rome itself had ceased to have any say in the matter. This is the part that demands we throw out a cherished assumption, because the obvious question is who on earth was doing this, and the obvious wrong answer is some incoming people who had taken the place over. But the builders of Roxter were not newcomers. They were not invaders who had wandered in and put up a hall in the ruins. In every sense that matters, they were Romans, by which we mean Romanized Britons, the descendants of the people who had lived Roman lives in this Roman city for generations, and who simply went on being Roman after the empire stopped administering them. They had not forgotten how to build, how to measure, how to plan a town. They had not reverted to anything. They carried the whole civilization forward in their own heads and hands, governing themselves, building for themselves, and living a recognizably urban life in a place that, on paper, was supposed to have ceased existing a century earlier. The city did not die when Rome left. It simply stopped sending Rome the paperwork. As for what this grand late structure actually was, the most persuasive interpretation only deepens the point. This was no barn and no barracks. It appears to have been a substantial, well-appointed residence, a building of real status with wings and covered walkways, the kind of home a person of considerable importance would commission to announce that they mattered. In other words, 6th century Roxter was not merely surviving. It still had a ruling class, people of wealth and authority who expected to live in a manner befitting their rank, and had the means and the skilled labour to make it happen. Somebody was in charge here. Somebody who thought of themselves in fundamentally Roman terms and wanted a house that said so, governing whatever this community had become in the long aftermath of empire. That is not the profile of a dying settlement clinging to life. It is the profile of a functioning town with a hierarchy, an economy capable of supporting grand projects, and a leadership confident enough to build for the future, all of it humming along 100 years into the supposed silence. So if all this was going on, if there were people laying engineered foundations and raising grand halls deep into the 6th century, why did nobody notice for so long? Why did generations of clever, careful scholars wander these sites and see only death? The answer takes us to York, and to a problem that is less about the past than about the tools we use to read it. The archaeologist Mark Wyman went back to the unglamorous heart of the matter, the broken pottery, and re-examined thousands upon thousands of humble sherds, and in doing so he put his finger on exactly why the 5th century had become a blank. What Wyman did was to give that invisible century back its voice, and he did it through the least glamorous material imaginable. He focused on a coarse, gritty kind of everyday pottery made in the east of Yorkshire, a humble local ware tempered with crushed stone, the sort of unremarkable kitchen crockery that nobody had ever thought to lavish attention on. But by studying it closely, by working out how it changed and where it came from and how it sat in the ground, he was able to demonstrate something that the coin-obsessed approach had completely missed. The potters of the region had carried on making this ware right through the supposed collapse and out the other side. The kilns kept firing, the pots kept being made and used and broken and thrown away, in a steady, unbroken rhythm of ordinary domestic life, exactly as they always had, with no dramatic gap where the catastrophe was meant to have happened. Life in the kitchens of Yorkshire did not skip a beat. There is a neat reason pottery proved a better witness than coins here. A coin is a political object, minted by the state, so when the state falters, the coins falter with it, and their absence reports on the health of the government rather than the people. A cooking pot answers to no emperor. It is made because somebody needs to cook dinner, used until it cracks, and thrown away, and that grubby little cycle carries on no matter who is in charge. So when the coins went quiet, the pots kept right on talking. What makes these two cases so powerful is that they catch the same truth from opposite directions. One is a single spectacular structure, a grand hall that should not exist according to the calendar. The other is the patient testimony of thousands of broken pots too dull for anyone to have faked. A lucky find at one site might be dismissed as a freak, an exception that proves the rule. But a freak building in the west and an unbroken pottery tradition in the north, arrived at by completely different methods and pointing to exactly the same conclusion, is not an exception. It is a pattern. And once archaeologists finally understood what they had been failing to see, once they learned to notice the ghost of a timber post and to take a humble, undated sherd seriously, the evidence of continued life began quietly surfacing at site after site, until the confident old map of a depopulated, derelict Britain started to look less like a record of the past, and more like a record of everything the diggers had walked straight over. The dead cities were never dead. They had merely been buried a second time under a century of assumptions. It is worth being precise about what actually changed in these towns, because the shift from stone to timber has too often been read as a slide into crudeness, and it was nothing of the kind. It was a sensible response to a transformed world. Roman stone and tile construction leaned on a vast imperial supply network. The same machinery that could once haul 100 tons of roofing across the sea purely for the look of the thing. Once that network wound down, dragging heavy materials over long distances stopped making any sense, and so people did the intelligent thing and built superbly with whatever lay close at hand, which across much of Britain meant timber. Choosing local wood over imported stone was not forgetting how to be civilized. It was adapting civilization to change circumstances, the difference between a household that has lost its money and one that has merely switched to a more convenient supplier. The skill, the planning, and the ambition all survived intact, as the grand timber building proves beyond argument. Only the shopping list had changed, and that, in the end, is the lesson the cities teach. The towns of Britain did not die after Rome. What changed was the form their life took, not the fact of it. The building materials shifted, with timber playing a greater role than stone. The economy changed shape as the coins disappeared and trade reorganized itself. The rhythms of urban life adapted to a world without an empire managing it from afar. But people went on living in these places, building in them, cooking in them, making their pots and raising their halls, getting on with the unglamorous business of existence. The empty, silent, ruined city of the textbooks turns out to have been very largely a trick of the light, an illusion conjured not by the absence of people in the past, but by the absence of coins to date them, and the absence of imagination in those who came looking. The lights in the cities never went out. We had simply lost the means to see them burning, and once you learn to read the broken pots instead of waiting for the coins, the darkness dissolves into a perfectly ordinary, perfectly stubborn, perfectly alive 6th century going calmly about its day. The people who lived through it would have been baffled to learn that later ages had pronounced them extinct, and faintly insulted to discover that the proof of their non-existence was simply that nobody, centuries hence, had thought to look properly. They were there all along, building, cooking, praying and arguing, in towns that never got the memo about their own deaths, and that carried on regardless. A town can keep cooking its dinners and firing its kilns without anyone in particular being in charge, but a province cannot run on stubbornness alone. Sooner or later somebody has to settle disputes, organise defence, decide who owes what to whom, and generally do the unglamorous work of holding a community together. So once the imperial machinery switched off, once the orders and the officials and the money stopped arriving from across the sea, The obvious question is not whether life continued, because we have already watched it do exactly that, but where the power went. Authority does not simply evaporate when the head office closes, it pools somewhere new. And the most interesting thing about post-Roman Britain is that the new power did not drop from the sky in the form of conquering kings, nor get imported by boatloads of strangers. It grew, slowly and locally, out of the one institution best equipped to provide it, which was the army that Rome left behind. To watch this happen, we have to travel to the bleak and beautiful northern frontier, to the great stone barrier that the Emperor Hadrian had thrown across the narrow waste of the island centuries earlier. Hadrian's Wall was the hard military edge of Roman Britain, a line of forts and turrets and mile castles manned by soldiers whose job was to watch the wild country beyond and keep the peace within. It was a genuinely staggering piece of engineering, a stone barrier running for some 70-odd miles clean across the narrowest part of the island, from one coast to the other, studded at regular intervals with small fortlets and lookout towers, and anchored by larger garrison forts, fronted by ditches and backed by a further great earthwork, the whole system designed to control movement and project the unmistakable message that you were now entering, or leaving, the Roman world. Building it had been a colossal undertaking, and manning it never stopped being one. For most of its history it was exactly what it looks like, a serious piece of military hardware staffed by professionals. But by the late period, the men holding the wall were not what most people picture when they imagine Roman legions, those gleaming ranks of soldiers shipped in from sunnier corners of the empire and rotated home when their tour was up. The frontier units had put down roots. Over generations, the soldiers had married local women, raised local families, and settled into the communities that clustered around every fort, the bustling little civilian towns where the troops spent their pay and lived their lives. By the end, the garrison was overwhelmingly homegrown, men born within sight of the wall, descended from soldiers who had never known any other home and never expected to. This was not an accident of neglect, but a deliberate feature of how the late empire defended its edges. The frontier troops of these final centuries were a very different breed from the mobile field armies that fought the empire's big campaigns. They were a settled, static garrison force, rooted permanently in the lands they guarded, and over time the arrangement had become more or less hereditary, with sons expected to take up the same duty their fathers had held, slotting into the unit as a matter of course. The state increasingly paid such men not in the reliable stream of imperial coin we might imagine, but partly in land, in grain, in the right to farm the territory around their forts, which bound them to the soil even more tightly. A soldier who is also a farmer, whose family has worked the same fields for generations, whose father and grandfather wore the same uniform on the same wall, is not a man who can be ordered to drop everything and sail away. He is, for all practical purposes, a local landowner who happens to carry a spear, and when the distant authority that once defined his job finally falls silent, he does not cease to exist. He simply keeps being what he already was, only now without anyone in particular to answer to. We know, too, that these frontier forts were never the grim, all-male barracks of popular imagination. Life along the wall was startlingly domestic. The evidence preserved at one of the great fort sites includes the everyday correspondence and debris of the community, and what it reveals is a world of wives and children, of birthday invitations and shopping lists and complaints about the weather, of officers' families socializing and ordinary people getting on with ordinary lives in the shadow of the ramparts. These were not lonely outposts of isolated warriors. They were full communities, with all the messy human furniture of any settled town, which makes the idea of a sudden tidy evacuation look even more absurd. You do not march an entire society of families, farmers and grandparents off into the sunset because the post stopped arriving. You stay home and you adapt, which is precisely what they did. This matters enormously, because it completely changes what should have happened when Rome let go. The standard story imagines the soldiers receiving the bad news, sighing, packing up their kit, and marching off to wherever soldiers go when the empire no longer needs them. But where exactly were these particular men supposed to march to? They were not visitors. They were not on assignment. This windswept stretch of northern Britain was not a posting they were itching to leave. It was the only place they had ever lived, the place their parents and grandparents were buried, the place their wives and children called home. When the pay stopped coming and the orders dried up, there was no evacuation, because there was nowhere to evacuate to and no reason to go. These were people standing in their own backyard. So they did the only sensible thing. They stayed and they got on with the considerable problem of how to keep living now that nobody was sending instructions. In a sense, they were only doing as they had been told. Tradition holds that around the time the imperial connection finally lapsed, the emperor of the day sent word to the communities of Britain with what amounts to the least helpful piece of management advice in history, instructing them, in effect, to see to their own defence from now on. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a landlord posting a notice that the building would no longer be maintained, and the tenants were welcome to sort out the plumbing themselves. Whether or not the message arrived in quite that form, it captures the situation exactly. The Empire was not so much pushing Britain away as shrugging and admitting it could no longer hold up its end of the bargain, and the islanders were left to look to their own protection. And that is precisely what they proceeded to do, with the soldiers on the wall and the chiefs on the hilltop stepping into the gap. When people sneer that the Britons fell into chaos once Rome abandoned them, it is worth remembering that the Britons were, quite literally, following the last order the Empire ever gave them. They were told to look after themselves, and they did, which is a strange thing to hold against anyone. The place where we can actually see them solving that problem is a fort on the wall that the Romans called Banner and that we know today as Burdeswald, and the breakthrough came through the careful work of the archaeologist Tony Wilmot. Like most forts along the frontier, Burdeswald had been built to a standard, sensible military plan, and among its most substantial structures were the granaries, the great stone storehouses where the grain that fed the garrison was kept dry and safe. To the Roman army, food security was not a romantic notion. It was the difference between an effective unit and a starving one, and so the granaries were robust, well-engineered buildings, raised floors and thick walls, the strategic infrastructure of an institution that understood an army marches on its stomach long before anyone coined the phrase. These were buildings made to last, and last they did, which turns out to be exactly why they have such an interesting story to tell. Because when Wilmot dug into the area of those granaries, he found that the story did not end when the Roman supply system did. Something had happened on top of the old stone storehouses after the military machine wound down, and at first the evidence was maddeningly faint. The kind of thing that an earlier, rougher generation of diggers would have shoveled straight through without a second glance. What confronted the excavators was not walls or rubble, but a series of hard, flat, compacted patches in the ground, subtle discolorations that meant nothing obvious to the untrained eye. They could easily have been dismissed as natural, as random, as nothing at all. And here Wilmot did something rather clever to test what he was looking at, a sort of controlled experiment in interpretation. He brought in a highly experienced excavator and, crucially, did not tell this person what he suspected or what answer he was hoping for. He simply asked them to look at the ground and say what they saw. It was, in effect, a blind test, designed to strip out the very human tendency to find exactly what you went looking for. And the seasoned digger, working purely from the evidence in front of them with no idea of the expected conclusion, read those hard, flat patches and identified them for what they truly were. They were post holes, the spots where massive timber uprights had once been driven into the ground to carry the weight of a building. Not one or two of them, either, but 12, arranged in the unmistakable footprint of an enormous structure. Someone, after the Roman troops were gone, had levelled the old granary and raised on top of it a gigantic hall of wood. Now, a great timber hall is not a random thing to build, and to anyone who knows the early medieval world it carries a very specific meaning. The mighty wooden hall, long and high and warm with a central hearth, was the beating heart of a lord's power in the centuries that followed. It was where a chief feasted his warriors, rewarded his followers, received his guests, dispensed his judgments, and generally performed the theatre of authority that held a warband together. The hall was the throne room, the banqueting suite, and the seat of government all rolled into one smoky, raftered space. So when a hall of this kind rises on the bones of a Roman military granary, the symbolism is almost too neat to be true. The building dedicated to feeding an imperial garrison had been replaced by the building from which a local ruler dominated his people. The supply depot had become a palace. The detail that makes this even more telling is that the Great Hall was not a single, isolated episode, a one-off built and then abandoned. The excavation revealed a sequence, a story unfolding over time on that same patch of ground. The old granary itself appears to have been pressed into new use first, its function changed, before being levelled to make way for the timber hall, and there are signs that the hall was in turn renewed, the seat of power maintained and rebuilt on the identical spot across the years. That continuity is the whole point, A flimsy, temporary shelter, thrown up by people about to leave, gets built once, and then rots. A centre of authority that is rebuilt and renewed generation after generation is the mark of a stable, lasting institution, of a line of rulers who held this place and passed it on. And all of this had to be teased out without the convenience of datable coins, which had long since stopped arriving, so the sequence was read instead from the layers themselves, from what sat on top of what. The persistence of building on that one spot, the deliberate maintenance of a hall where a granary had stood, is itself the evidence that someone here intended to stay, to rule, and to be succeeded. To understand why a hall, of all buildings, was the natural seat of this new power, you have to understand what actually went on inside one, because it was the social engine that made a warlord in the first place. A leader of this age held his followers not through paperwork or salaries, but through the intensely personal bond of the feast. In the warmth of the great hall, around the central fire, the lord fed his fighting men, filled their cups and rewarded their loyalty with gifts, fine weapons, ornaments, a share of whatever had been won, and in return those men pledged him their service and, in principle at least, their lives. This was a relationship sealed not in ink but in firelight and generosity, renewed at every feast, sung about by whatever passed for a court poet, and binding in a way no contract could match. The hall was therefore not merely a big house, it was the machine that manufactured loyalty, the place where a band of armed men was forged into something that would follow one leader into danger. And the timber hall was not a sad downgrade from Roman stone, but the very thing these people prized, the centrepiece of their entire idea of what power and belonging looked like. A lord without a hall was a lord without followers, and a lord without followers was just a man with a sword and a lot of optimism. And that single architectural swap tells the whole story of how power was reborn in these years. Picture the man who would have commanded the fort in its final Roman days, the officer in charge of the garrison. When the empire still functioned, his authority flowed downward from Rome, delegated to him by a chain of commands stretching all the way to an emperor across the water. But once that chain was cut, his authority did not vanish. It simply stopped coming from above and started coming from below, rooted in the only things that still mattered, his control of armed men, his fortified stronghold, and the loyalty of a community that needed protecting. His position very likely passed from father to son, because in a world without a central state to appoint officials, power that you can hand to your children is the only kind that lasts. And so, without any dramatic moment of coronation, without anyone declaring a new era, the Roman commander quietly transformed into something older and more personal, a local strongman, a petty king ruling his own small patch of the world. It is worth stressing how short a step that really was, because it was nothing like the leap from civilian to monarch that the word king might suggest to us. The late empire already ran its frontiers through powerful regional military commanders, men entrusted with the defence of whole stretches of border and the troops that held them, figures of considerable independent authority, even while the system still functioned. A man in that role already commanded soldiers, already controlled territory, already extracted resources from the land to keep his forces fed. The only thing that changed when the empire fell away was the question of who, if anyone, he answered to, and the answer became nobody. He kept doing the identical job. He simply stopped reporting to a superior who no longer existed. Seen that way, the post-Roman warlord was not some wild new invention sprung from the ashes of civilization, but the natural continuation of an office the empire itself had created, a frontier commander who had quietly become his own emperor on a very small scale. The transition was so smooth that there may never have been a single day on which anyone could have said the change had happened. It happened the way nightfall does, gradually and then completely. The economics of his authority underwent an equally smooth and revealing transformation. Under Rome, the people of the region had handed over taxes, often in the form of grain, the very grain those granaries existed to store, and in exchange the state had, in theory, provided order and protection. Strip away the imperial bureaucracy and the paperwork and the official language, and what is left is a relationship that needs no translation. The new local lord still collected from the surrounding population, and he still offered protection in return, but the polite fiction of taxation had been replaced by something far franker and far older. Keep paying, the arrangement now ran, and we will keep you safe. It was, to put it plainly, a protection racket, though one that the people on both ends would have understood as perfectly natural and even reassuring, given that the alternative was facing a dangerous world with no muscle of your own. Civilization had not collapsed into chaos. It had reorganized itself around the man with the warriors and the walls, which, when you strip away the marble and the ideals, is roughly how a great deal of human power has always worked. And it would be a mistake to sneer at this as simple extortion, because the protection on offer was no empty threat dressed up as a service. The whole reason a barrier had been flung across the north in the first place was that the country beyond it was genuinely dangerous, home to peoples who had spent centuries eyeing the richer lands to the south and were perfectly willing to come and take what they could carry. With the imperial army no longer patrolling the frontier, that danger did not politely disappear. If anything, it grew, and a scattered population of farmers had no realistic way to defend themselves against organised raiders bent on stealing their livestock, their harvest, and sometimes their people. A local lord with a fortified stronghold and a band of fighting men was, in that light, not a parasite but a necessity, the only thing standing between a farming community and ruin. Handing over a share of your grain to the man who would ride out and protect you was less a racket than the closest thing to an insurance premium the age could offer, and farmers, being practical people, paid it for the very good reason that the alternative was so much worse. The arrangement worked because both sides got something real out of it, which is exactly why it spread. The economic plumbing behind all this had been laid down long before, which is part of why the transition was so seamless. For centuries, the presence of a hungry garrison had shaped the entire farming economy of the surrounding countryside, with local agriculture geared toward feeding the troops, the produce of the fields funneled toward the fort, and those great stone granaries standing as the central node of the whole system, the warehouse at the end of the supply line. The fort was, in a real sense, the regional economy's biggest customer and most important institution all at once. So when the imperial pay chests stopped arriving, the underlying machinery did not have to be reinvented, because it was already there and already pointing the right way. The grain still flowed toward the stronghold still housed the men with the weapons, and the only thing that changed was the official story told about why. What had been the dutiful provisioning of an imperial garrison simply became the rendering of food to a local lord, the same carts rolling to the same place along the same roads, delivering to a man who now answered to himself. The new order did not have to build its economy from scratch. It inherited a fully functioning one and quietly changed the name on the door. The truly important point about Burdeswold is that it was no freak, no one-off curiosity at a single lonely fort. The same thing was happening up and down the Great Wall itself, where other forts have yielded their own traces of life carrying on long after the Empire's writ expired, of communities that stayed put and remade their forts into homes and strongholds for a new kind of leadership. The frontier did not empty out and fall silent the moment the orders stopped. It quietly converted itself, fort by fort, from a line of imperial garrisons into a string of small, self-governing power centres, each one anchored on the solid stone the Empire had so helpfully left behind. Burdeswold is simply the place where the transformation was caught most clearly in the ground, the clearest window onto a process that was unfolding all along the northern edge of the country. And it was not confined to the Roman forts of the north either, which is what makes it a genuine island-wide pattern, rather than a regional quirk. Far to the south and west, the ancient hill forts, the great earthwork strongholds that had crowned the high ground since long before the Romans ever arrived, were being reoccupied and rebuilt. Communities returned to these commanding hilltops, refurbished the old ramparts, threw up new defences, and raised their own timber halls within, turning the strongholds of their distant ancestors into the power centres of a new age. One of these refortified hilltops would later become so entangled with legend that it was popularly identified as the very seat of a famous king, the supposed location of his fabled court, complete with a thriving tourist trade built on the association. Whether or not any particular hero ever set foot there, the archaeology is clear that these were real centres of real power, busy and defended and important, exactly the kind of place a successful war leader of the period would have called home. The excavations at that famous hilltop revealed precisely the southern mirror of what Burdeswold shows in the north. The ancient ramparts, long abandoned, had been massively refortified in the post-Roman centuries, crowned with a new defensive wall and pierced by a substantial timber gateway, the kind of imposing entrance designed to impress as much as to defend. And on the summit, within the protected enclosure, stood the foundations of a large timber hall, the unmistakable seat of a chief, the same feasting centre of authority we met built over the granary far to the north. Here was no different story, but the same story told in a different landscape. A community gathering behind refurbished walls under the rule of a powerful local leader who governed from his hall on the height. One process, two settings. The soldier turned lord on the stone frontier and the chief enthroned on the reoccupied hilltop, both reaching for exactly the same solution to exactly the same problem, which is the surest sign that what we are looking at is not a scatter of coincidences but the genuine political shape of the age. And that brings us almost inevitably to the figure who has haunted this whole story from the beginning, because this is the genuine historical soil from which the towering legend of Arthur most plausibly grew. Forget for a moment the crowned king in shining plate armour, the round table, the courtly romance, all the gorgeous later embroidery. Strip it back to what the evidence actually supports, and what you find is not one specific man with a documented biography, but a recurring type, the strong post-Roman war leader. In a fragmented land where the old imperial order had dissolved, where local strongmen ruled from timber halls and protection was the only currency of safety, the people who thrived were the ones who could fight, organize, inspire loyalty, and hold a frightened community together against the dangers of the age. The figure we call Arthur is most convincingly understood not as a single historical king, but as the distilled memory of this kind of leader, a composite hero onto whom later generations heaped the deeds and the glamour of many such men. The name became a sort of label for an entire phenomenon, the powerful local protector who kept his people safe when no empire would, and the legend grew by dressing that hard, practical reality in the finery of romance until the original, grittier truth was almost completely buried beneath it. It is worth noticing that the very oldest scraps of memory about this figure point in exactly this direction, away from the crowned king and toward the war leader. In the earliest layers of tradition, before the centuries of polishing set in, the figure is remembered less as a monarch presiding over a glittering court, and more as a commander of battles, a leader in war, the man others rallied behind when there was fighting to be done. That is a job description, not a coronation, and it fits the world we have been describing perfectly. A world that did not need ceremonial kings half so much as it needed people who could win fights and keep a community alive. Everything that came later, the crown, the castle, the magic, the doomed love affairs, was added by storytellers of far gentler ages who could afford to be romantic, precisely because they no longer lived with the dangers that produced the original. They took the memory of a hard man who led other hard men through a hard time and turned him into a fairy tale, which is a perfectly understandable thing to do, though it does rather bury the more interesting truth underneath the gilding. There is a quiet irony in where all of this led, because the end result looked remarkably like the beginning. Once the unifying weight of the empire was lifted, Britain did not dissolve into a single uniform wasteland, nor did it cohere into one neat successor state. Instead, it settled back into a patchwork of small kingdoms, each ruled by its own strongman from his own hall behind his own defences, jostling and allying and squabbling with the neighbours, which is more or less exactly the political landscape that had existed long before any Roman ever waded ashore. The centuries of imperial rule turn out to have been, in a sense, an interlude, a temporary overlay of central authority pressed onto a land whose natural shape was a mosaic of local powers. When the overlay was peeled away, the underlying pattern simply reasserted itself. As if the island had a default setting, it returned to the moment nobody was forcing it to be otherwise. The strong men in their timber halls were not a tragic falling off from Roman order. They were Britain reverting to type. But reverting to type politically did not mean shedding everything Rome had brought, and this is where the picture grows genuinely subtle. The men who ruled from these halls were not crude barbarians who had forgotten civilization. Many of them still thought of themselves as Roman in the ways that counted, carried Roman names, very often held to the Christian faith, kept up Roman habits of dress and table and speech, and prized their connection to the great culture they had grown up inside. The political form of their power was local and personal, a warlord in a wooden hall, but the people living that life still moved through a world flavoured by Rome, still measured buildings in Roman feet, still imported the occasional luxury from far away when they could get it. What we are looking at, then, is not a simple slide backward into a pre-Roman past, but a genuine blend, a society that had taken the political shape its landscape favoured, while keeping a great deal of the cultural furniture the empire had installed. It was something new, neither fully Roman nor fully a return to the old ways, but a distinctively post-Roman creation, which is exactly the sort of inventive mixing this island has always done best, as the rest of its long story keeps demonstrating. What all of this finally overturns is the most basic assumption of the darkness myth, the idea that with Rome gone, Britain became a leaderless wasteland waiting passively to be rescued or conquered. The reality was precisely the opposite. The island did not lack power after Rome. It grew its own, organically and pragmatically from the ground up. The soldiers who held the frontier did not abandon it, they inherited it. The forts that had served an empire became the seats of homegrown lords. The food stores became feasting halls, the commanders became kings, and the taxes became tribute, every piece of the old system quietly repurposed into something new and locally rooted. This was not the death of order, but its rebirth in a different shape, and it owed nothing to invasion and everything to adaptation. The men who wielded real power in these so-called dark centuries were not strangers who arrived to fill a vacuum. They were the people who had been there all along, looking at the world the departing empire had left them, and deciding, sensibly enough, that someone had better take charge, and that it might as well be them. The darkness once again turns out to have been nothing of the kind. It was simply power changing hands so quietly that later ages, looking for the drama of a fall, walked straight past the far more interesting reality of a people governing themselves. A society can have living towns and homegrown rulers, but none of it counts for anything if the people cannot eat. And so we arrive at the deepest, most visceral version of the whole darkness myth, the one that lodges in the imagination more stubbornly than any tale of empty streets or ruined villas. It is the image of the land itself going wild. Picture it the way the old story asks you to. The neat Roman fields, once striped with grain, falling silent as the farmers vanish, the hedges collapsing, the ditches silting up, and the great dark forest creeping back in to swallow everything, until a countryside that had fed a province for centuries dissolves into trackless, tangled wilderness. If that happened, then the people really were gone, because nothing else could explain it. The returning wildwood is the supposed proof of the catastrophe, the green shroud drawn over a dead civilization. It is a powerful picture. It is also, as the ground itself will tell us in remarkable detail, almost entirely false. The reason this particular test is so revealing comes down to a simple fact about how the natural world behaves, one that anyone who has ever neglected a garden for a single summer understands in their bones. Open, cultivated farmland is not a natural state. It is an artificial condition, wrestled into being and then held there by constant human effort. The moment people stop fighting to keep it open, nature begins, with great enthusiasm and no sentimentality whatsoever, to take it back. First come the weeds and the coarse grasses, then the scrub, then the fast-growing pioneer trees, and within a few short decades a field left entirely alone will be well on its way to becoming woodland again. This means the question of whether the forest returned after Rome is not some vague matter of atmosphere. It is a sharp, almost binary test. If the farmers disappeared, the trees would have come marching back quickly and unmistakably, and if the trees did not come back, then the only possible explanation is that somebody was still out there, year after year, doing the hard work of keeping them at bay. The presence or absence of woodland is, in effect, a direct readout of the presence or absence of working farmers. All we need is a witness honest enough to tell us which it was. That witness turns out to be almost comically humble, a thing so small that you breathe it in by the thousand every time you step outside in spring without ever giving it a thought. Pollen. The fine dust that plants release to reproduce is one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence in all of archaeology, and the reason is its sheer, almost unreasonable toughness. The outer shell of a pollen grain is made of one of the most durable organic substances known, a material so resistant to decay that grains can survive for many thousands of years in the right conditions, long after the plant that made them has rotted to nothing. Plants produce this dust in staggering quantities, far more than could ever fertilize anything, and the surplus drifts everywhere on the wind, settling over the whole landscape in a constant invisible rain. And here is the detail that makes it so useful. The grains of different plants are not identical. Under a microscope, each kind has its own distinctive shape, its own texture and structure, so that a trained eye can look at a single tiny grain and say with confidence whether it came from an oak, a grass, a cereal crop, or a particular wildflower. The air around us, in other words, is perpetually full of a microscopic record of every plant growing nearby, written in a code that survives almost anything. The trick is finding a place where that endless rain of pollen was caught and kept in order, and nature provides the perfect filing system in the form of lakes and bogs. Year after year, the pollen drifting over a body of still water settles onto the surface and sinks to the bottom, where it is buried under the next year's layer, and the next, and the next, sealed away in the cold, airless mud where the oxygen that drives decay cannot reach it. Over centuries this builds up into a deep stack of sediment, laid down in order with the oldest material at the bottom and the most recent at the top, like the pages of a diary that the landscape has been keeping, entirely by accident, for thousands of years. Drive a hollow tube down into that mud and pull out a long, slender core, and you are holding a continuous record of the vegetation that grew around that spot, century by century, page by page. It is the closest thing we have to a security camera trained on the countryside of the deep past, quietly recording the whole time with nobody aware it was running. Reading that record is painstaking work, but the principle is elegantly simple. A specialist takes the core, divides it into thin slices by depth, and under the microscope counts the pollen grains in each slice, tallying how many came from each kind of plant. The proportions tell the story. A layer thick with the pollen of grasses, of cereal crops, and of the particular weeds that thrive in disturbed, cultivated ground, is the unmistakable signature of open farmland, fields and pasture worked by human hands. A layer dominated instead by the pollen of trees is the signature of woodland, of a landscape where the forest holds sway. By reading the slices from bottom to top, the analyst watches the balance between open ground and forest shift back and forth through time, and by sending samples off for radiocarbon dating, which measures the steady decay of a natural clock built into all living things, each of those shifts can be pinned to an actual date. It is worth pausing to appreciate that last point, because it neatly sidesteps the very problem that had blinded so many earlier investigators. The disappearance of datable coins had left a great hole in the chronology of these centuries, but pollen does not care in the slightest whether anyone was minting money. The radiocarbon clock keeps ticking regardless, and so the landscape can be dated even across the very stretch of time that the coin-dependent record had rendered invisible. Pollen does not even have to work alone, because the same muddy archives preserve a whole supporting cast of evidence that points the same way. Among the most telling is a humble little plant whose pollen is the next best thing to a signature left by a farmer. It is a low, tough weed that flourishes wherever people trample, graze, and disturb the ground, thriving on exactly the kind of beaten, worked-over earth that surrounds any farm and pasture, and its presence in the record is so reliably tied to human activity that specialists treat it almost as the fingerprint of the plough. Where its pollen is plentiful, people were busy on the land. Where it fades, they had eased off. Alongside it, the cores often hold tiny flecks of charcoal, the microscopic soot of fires, which records the burning that farmers used to clear scrub and refresh pasture. Read together, the cereal grains, the trampling weeds, and the charcoal build a picture far richer than any single line on a graph. A detailed account not just of whether the land was wooded, but of how intensely it was being worked, and by people doing recognisably agricultural things. The first great surprise these long records deliver, before we even reach the crucial centuries, is that the wildwood the myth imagines came surging back had, in most of the country, been gone for a very long time already. The same cores that document the post-Roman period also reach back thousands of years further, and what they reveal is that the clearing of Britain was not a Roman achievement at all, but an enormous, slow, multi-generational project carried out by countless farmers across the prehistoric ages, hacking and burning and grazing the forest back acre by acre over millennia. By the time the Romans ever arrived, the island was already, across great swathes of its surface, an open, farmed, well-worked country, not a few timid clearings huddled in an endless dark forest. The popular image of Roman and post-Roman Britain as a thin scatter of settlements, lost in primeval woodland, is itself a fantasy. So the dramatic question of whether the wild would reclaim the land after Rome rather misses the point, because in most places there was no great wildwood left to do the reclaiming. The trees had been seen off centuries before, and they were in no position to stage a sudden comeback across a land that had long since stopped being theirs. A point about the method makes the farming signal even more compelling than it first appears, and it has to do with the awkward fact that not all plants advertise themselves equally. Pollen analysis is quietly biased toward the plants that fling their pollen onto the wind in vast clouds. The trees and grasses that reproduce by broadcasting while plants pollinated by insects, or those whose heavy pollen barely travels, are badly underrepresented in the record. Cereal crops fall into the shy category. A field of grain releases comparatively little airborne pollen, and what it does release is heavy and tends to fall close to home, rather than drifting far across the landscape to settle in a distant lake. The consequence is delightfully counterintuitive. Because cereals are such poor self-publicists, even a modest showing of cereal pollen in a core implies a substantial amount of actual cultivation somewhere nearby, far more than the raw numbers might suggest. So when these records show the grain crops persisting through the post-Roman centuries, that quiet signal is doing a great deal of heavy lifting. The fields were shouting, it is only that the microphone was turned down low. It is worth dwelling too on the sheer unglamorous labour that lies behind every one of these tidy conclusions, because it is easy to say the pollen was counted and quite another thing to do it. A specialist takes each thin slice of mud, treats it with a sequence of harsh chemicals to dissolve away everything that is not pollen, mounts the concentrated residue on a glass slide, and then sits at a microscope identifying and tallying the grains one by one, often counting many hundreds from a single slice before moving on to the next, and the next, all the way down a core that may represent thousands of years. It is exacting, eye-straining, faintly heroic work, the scientific equivalent of reading an entire library by squinting at one letter at a time. And yet from this patient counting of microscopic dust at the bottom of a pond comes one of the most sweeping corrections in the whole study of these centuries, an overturning of a grand historical narrative achieved not by discovering a lost chronicle or a buried treasure, but by people willing to spend their careers identifying ancient sneeze particles under a lens. History, it turns out, is sometimes rewritten one speck at a time. The person who turned this method on the crucial question was the paleoecologist Petra Dark of the University of Reading, and she did it in just about the most perfectly chosen spot imaginable. She took her cores from the sediments of a small lake called Crag Lough, which sits tucked right against Hadrian's Wall in the wild northern country we have already visited. Think about why that location is so ideal. This was the frontier, the militarized edge of the province, the region that the darkness story insists should have been hit hardest of all by the Roman withdrawal, the place where, if abandonment and collapse happened anywhere, they surely happened here. If the wildwood was going to come surging back across emptied land, the depopulated zone around the old military wall is exactly where you would expect to catch it doing so. The lake had been quietly filing away the evidence the entire time. All anyone had to do was go and read it. There is an added strength in having drawn the record from a lake rather than from some tiny isolated puddle, and it concerns the reach of the evidence. A small enclosed bog tends to capture only the pollen of its immediate surroundings, the vegetation of one little patch, which can be misleading if that patch happens to be unusual. A lake of decent size, by contrast, gathers pollen blown in from a much wider area, drawing its dust from across the surrounding countryside, and effectively averaging out the whole district into a single record. So the picture from such a site is not the story of one farmer's awkward field, but a broad regional portrait, the combined testimony of an entire stretch of land. When that kind of record shows the country staying open and worked, it is not a quirk of one favoured spot. It is the considered verdict of a whole landscape, which is exactly why a single well-chosen lake can carry so much weight, and why its refusal to show the expected collapse is so hard to wave away. And when the cores came up and the grains were counted and the layers were dated, the result was a quiet but devastating blow to the old story. If the catastrophe had been real, the diagram should have shown it dramatically. The line for tree pollen climbing steeply as the forest reclaimed the abandoned fields, the open ground indicators collapsing as farming ceased. That is emphatically not what the record showed. There was a modest increase in birch, which is precisely the tree you would expect to nudge in at the edges, since birch is the great opportunist of the plant world, a fast and scrappy colonizer that pounces on any scrap of neglected ground it can find. But a slight uptick in the most aggressive pioneer species is a very long way from the wholesale return of forest the myth demands. There was no great dark wave of woodland sweeping back across the land. The countryside around the wall stayed, overwhelmingly, open. An open country does not maintain itself. The only thing that keeps a landscape clear of trees, decade after decade, is people, working it, grazing it, burning it, and ploughing it. The land stayed open because the farmers never left. The catastrophe that was supposed to be written most vividly into the most vulnerable region simply was not there. It is worth being concrete about what keeping that land open actually required, because it was not a passive thing. The single most effective enemy of returning forest is not the plough, but the grazing animal. A field full of sheep or cattle is a field where every tender tree seedling that dares to sprout is promptly bitten off and eaten before it can ever become a sapling, and a landscape grazed steadily by livestock will stay open almost indefinitely, with relatively little other effort. So the unbroken open ground signature in the pollen does not necessarily mean armies of ploughmen toiling over endless cornfields. It means, at the very least, that herds and flocks were still out on the land, tended by people who depended on them, year after year without a break. The animals were the gardeners, relentlessly mowing down the forest's every attempt at a return, and behind the animals stood the herders, and behind the herders stood functioning communities with a stake in the land. The quiet flatness of that pollen line is, in its way, the sound of a countryside still full of working people and their beasts, going about the seasonal round exactly as their grandparents had, untroubled by the news that history had declared them extinct. There is a further implication tucked inside the frontier result that is genuinely striking. This was the militarized north, and we have already seen that the old forts there were turning into the strongholds of local lords. A lord with a hall full of warriors to feast does not live on air. He needs a surplus, a steady flow of food produced by somebody else and handed over to keep his followers fed. The fact that the land around the wall stayed not merely inhabited but productively farmed, in some readings even intensively so, fits that world perfectly. Somebody was growing more than they strictly needed for themselves, and that surplus was what made the new local powers possible in the first place. The pollen of the frontier is, in a sense, the agricultural foundation beneath the timber halls, the proof that the fields were doing the unglamorous work that allowed the warriors to do the glamorous kind. It helps to put some flesh on what this working countryside actually contained, because the words open land and farming can stay abstract until you picture the real thing. This was a landscape of grain and grazing, of barley and wheat in the better fields, of hardier oats and rye where the ground was poorer, all of it harvested by hand and ground for the bread that was the daily foundation of nearly every meal. It was a landscape thick with livestock, above all with sheep, whose wool clothed the population, and whose constant nibbling, as we have seen, did so much to hold the trees at bay, alongside cattle for milk, meat, and the muscle that pulled the plough, and pigs rooting through the scrub at the woodland edge. It was crisscrossed by the boundaries of fields that had often been laid out generations earlier, and were simply maintained, by trackways worn smooth by animals and carts, by the everyday infrastructure of a settled agricultural world. None of this is exotic or dramatic. That is precisely the point. It is the ordinary, unremarkable, deeply familiar machinery of country life, the same in its essentials whether the year was 400 or 600. Humming along through the very decades the old story insisted were a silent void. The fields were not empty. They were busy in the most boring and most reassuring way imaginable, season after season, with a steadiness that no catastrophe ever managed to interrupt. Now, a single lake, however well chosen, could in principle be a local exception, and good evidence is never built on one site alone. So the truly powerful part of the picture comes from putting Crag Lough alongside the many other places across Britain where the same kind of analysis has been carried out. Dozens of pollen records scattered the length and breadth of the country, each one its own independent diary of its own patch of land. And when you lay them all side by side, what emerges is not the uniform nationwide catastrophe the old textbooks promised. It is something far more interesting and far more believable, which is variety. In some places, yes, there was a measure of woodland regrowth, a sign that farming had eased off and nature had recovered a little ground. But in a great many places the land went on being worked exactly as it had been before, the open ground signature holding steady straight through the supposed collapse without so much as a wobble. And in some places, remarkably, the signs of cultivation actually grew stronger after Rome, the farmed area expanding rather than shrinking, as though certain communities, freed from imperial demands or simply getting on with their lives, were busier on the land than ever. The story the pollen tells is not one of a country dying. It is one of a country carrying on, in 1,000 different local ways, exactly as living countries always do. And the variation is not random noise either, because once you look closely the patchwork starts to make a great deal of sense. The places most likely to show a little woodland creeping back tend to be the marginal lands, the higher, colder, poorer ground that is always the first to be let go whenever farming contracts even slightly, because it was never very rewarding to work in the first place. The rich, fertile lowlands, by contrast, the prime farmland that had been the heart of agricultural life for ages, mostly stayed firmly in use, since nobody walks away from good soil if they can possibly help it. So the scattered signs of regrowth are not the footprints of a vanished population, but the perfectly ordinary breathing of a living agricultural system, easing off the difficult edges while holding fast to the productive core, exactly the sort of sensible adjustment farmers make in any age when conditions shift. It is the behaviour of people managing their land thoughtfully, not the silence of people who are no longer there. Far from proving collapse, the very unevenness of the picture is itself a sign of life, because only a working countryside full of people making decisions about where to put their effort produces a pattern that varied and that rational. That patchwork is the real death blow to the grand generalization, because the darkness myth never offered nuance. It claimed something sweeping and total, a whole land going to ruin all at once, the kind of tidy, dramatic, universal collapse that had been confidently asserted in the middle of the last century on the strength of very little actual evidence and a great deal of prior assumption. Earlier scholars, working with only a handful of scattered records and already convinced in their own minds that the end of Rome meant the end of everything, had taken their thin scraps of data and stretched them into a blanket statement about the entire island. The accumulated weight of the modern evidence pulls that blanket clean away. There was no universal abandonment because the land itself, recorded automatically and impartially across hundreds of square miles, simply does not show one. You cannot argue a forest into existence that the pollen says was never there. The old consensus had been propped up too by a second assumption that the same evidence quietly dismantles, the comfortable belief that whatever happened next involved newcomers arriving to a depopulated, overgrown land and heroically clearing the wilderness to plant their own farms. It is a tidy narrative, the empty country waiting for fresh hands to tame it, and it has the great advantage of casting the later inhabitants as pioneers rather than as people who simply walked into a going concern. The trouble is that it requires a wilderness for the pioneers to clear, and the pollen flatly refuses to supply one. The land was already open, already farmed, already humming with agricultural life across the very period when it was supposed to have reverted to forest and sat empty awaiting rescue. There were no vast tracts of returned woodland for anyone to dramatically reclaim, because the existing population had never let the woodland return in the first place. Whatever changes came to Britain in the following centuries, they came to a countryside that was occupied and working, not to a green and empty stage, and that single fact rearranges a great deal of the story that used to be told. It is only fair to meet the obvious objection head-on, because the written sources that survive from these centuries do speak of hardship, of war, of disease and suffering, and it would be wrong to pretend none of that was real. The point of the pollen is not to insist that life was easy, or that nothing ever went wrong, for of course it did, as it does in every age. Local disasters certainly struck. Particular communities surely suffered grievously, and there were doubtless years and districts where things went very badly indeed. But a local catastrophe is a fundamentally different creature from the total, island-wide collapse the old myth proclaimed, and the two must not be muddled together. A region can take a terrible blow, a bad stretch of war or sickness, and still recover, still keep its fields in use, still feed itself in the end, and the broad sweep of the environmental record captures exactly that resilience. The land as a whole kept working even where individual corners of it endured hard times. The pollen does not deny that these centuries had their share of misery. It simply denies that the misery ever added up to the death of a civilization, and on that crucial distinction the entire argument turns. There is a broader lesson buried in all this, and it is one of the most valuable things the whole subject has to teach. We're used to thinking of history as something written down, a record handed to us by people who lived through events and set their version on the page. But people who write things down have feelings, fears, motives, and agendas, and the few dramatic written laments that survive from these centuries were composed by individuals with their own reasons for painting the times as dark and fallen. Pollen has no such failings. It was not produced by anyone trying to make a point. It is not an artifact made by human hands at all, but the land recording itself, automatically, indifferently, with no story to tell and no audience to impress. It cannot exaggerate for effect, cannot moralize, cannot lament a golden age that never was. It simply settled and sank and waited. And when we finally learned to read it, it told us the plain truth with a flatness that no passionate chronicler could ever match. When the silent, unconscious witnesses of the earth contradict the dramatic testimony of the written word, it is very often the silent witnesses we should believe, precisely because they never knew they were testifying at all. A chronicler can lie, or exaggerate, or simply be mistaken about the wider world beyond his own door. A pollen grain has no opinion about the fall of Rome, and that perfect indifference is exactly what makes it trustworthy. There is one more thing the unbroken fields quietly prove, and it may be the most important of all, because farming is not only labour, but knowledge. A working agricultural landscape depends on an enormous, accumulated store of practical understanding, when to plough and sow and reap, how to carry a herd through the seasons, which fields to rest and which to work, how to keep up the boundaries and the drainage and the breeding stock. All of it learned slowly and handed down from one generation to the next by example and habit. That kind of knowledge is fragile. It lives in people, and if the people truly vanish, even for a generation, it is lost, and it cannot simply be conjured back from nothing by whoever comes along afterward. The fact that the land went on being competently farmed straight through these centuries therefore proves something deeper than mere occupation. It proves an unbroken chain of teaching and learning, parents showing children, neighbours trading methods, the whole inherited craft of working this particular soil passed steadily down without a break. You cannot have continuity of farming without continuity of farmers, and you cannot have continuity of farmers without continuity of the knowledge that made them. The open fields are, in the end, the fingerprints of a population that never once let go of its own land. So the final image to carry away from the soil and the pollen is the opposite of the one the myth tried to plant. The countryside of post-Roman Britain was not a wilderness reclaiming a corpse. It was a working landscape, ploughed and grazed and harvested, its fields kept stubbornly open by the unending labour of people who had not gone anywhere. The grain still grew, the animals still fed on the pasture, and the produce of that land still filled the bellies of the townsfolk getting on with their lives and the warriors feasting in their halls. The lights that the old story claimed had gone out in the cities had not gone out in the fields either. They were burning there too, in every cleared acre and every ripening crop. In a countryside that went right on feeding its people through the centuries, it was supposed to have spent dead and overgrown. The land, asked directly and without prejudice, gives the same answer as the pots and the halls and the buildings before it. Nobody had vanished. Everybody had simply carried on. And there is something quietly humbling in realizing that the grandest correction to a centuries-old story came not from a dramatic discovery, but from the patient reading of dust that had been lying at the bottom of a northern lake the entire time, waiting through all those years while scholars confidently described an emptiness that the mud beneath their feet flatly denied. The evidence had never been hidden. It had only been overlooked, dismissed as too small and too dull to matter. The fields were full, the lake was keeping its records, and the only thing genuinely missing was anyone willing to go and check. The fields were full, the towns were busy, the halls were feasting, and the land itself testified that nobody had gone anywhere. But the darkness myth has one last fortification to defend, perhaps its most emotionally satisfying claim of all, which is the idea of isolation. Even if Britain was inhabited, the story goes, it was cut off, sealed away behind the grey waters of the Channel, a forgotten island drifting at the lonely edge of the world, while civilization carried on without it somewhere far to the south. A backwater, in the truest sense, stagnant and disconnected, its people scratching out their lives in ignorance of everything beyond their own muddy horizon. To test that final claim, we have to go to the most dramatic and remote-seeming spot in the whole country, a windswept crag of rock jutting out into the Atlantic on the far southwestern tip of the island, a place called Tintagel. Tintagel has a reputation, of course, because in later centuries the storytellers seized upon this brooding, sea-battered headland and declared it the very birthplace of the legendary king himself, the cradle of Camelot, and to this day the romance clings to the cliffs and keeps the gift shops busy. But the genuine history buried in the turf turns out to be far stranger and far more impressive than any fairy tale, and we owe our knowledge of it, oddly enough, to a fire. In the early 1980s, a blaze swept across the headland and burned off the covering of grass and scrub, and once the smoke cleared and archaeologists came to look at the scorched ground, they found that the fire had done them an enormous favour. Laid bare beneath the vanished vegetation were the outlines of building after building, the foundations of a whole cluster of structures crowded onto the rock. Dozens of them, the footprint not of a lonely hermit's refuge but of a substantial, busy, important place. Whatever Tintagel had been in these supposedly dark centuries, it had not been empty. What it had been, almost certainly, was a seat of power. The position alone tells you as much, because this was not a spot chosen for comfort or convenience. A storm-lashed promontory, all but cut off from the mainland by a narrow neck of rock, is a miserable place to live if your only concern is staying warm and dry. But it is a magnificent place to be if your concern is controlling who comes and goes by sea, and impressing everyone who lays eyes on you. A cluster of buildings perched on a near-island fortress, commanding the approaches to a sheltered landing, is the signature of a ruler, one of those local lords we have already watched rising from the wreckage of the old order, here governing the southwestern kingdom and, crucially, the trade that flowed through it. Whoever held Tintagel held the gateway, and holding the gateway to a flow of Mediterranean luxury was a very good way to be rich and powerful in this corner of the world. The grandeur was the point. This was a stronghold designed to announce that its master was somebody who mattered, somebody worth sailing thousands of miles to do business with. And then came the truly electrifying detail. The things scattered across the site in astonishing quantity. Pottery. Not the humble local kitchenware we met earlier, the honest gritty stuff that proved ordinary life carried on, but something else entirely. Thousands upon thousands of fragments of fine imported ceramics, vessels that had very obviously not been made anywhere near Cornwall. This was exotic material, the broken remains of goods that had travelled a very long way to end up shattered on a clifftop at the end of the earth, and their sheer abundance turned the whole isolation theory on its head before a single laboratory test had even been run. You do not accumulate thousands of pieces of foreign tableware and storage jars by being cut off from the world. You accumulate them by trading with it, energetically and often. The question, naturally, was where exactly all this had come from, and answering it required a beautifully precise piece of science. The ceramic specialist David Williams, working at Southampton, turned to a technique called thin section analysis, which sounds dull and is in fact a kind of detective magic. A sliver of pottery is ground down so impossibly thin that light can shine straight through it, and under a microscope the tiny mineral grains embedded in the ancient clay spring into view, each one a clue to where that clay was dug and what was mixed into it. Clay from different parts of the world carries different mineral signatures, a geological fingerprint as distinctive as a postmark, and by reading those grains an expert can often pin a humble potsherd to the very region, sometimes nearly the very kiln where it was made. When Williams examined the fabric of these vessels, the minerals told a remarkable story. Among the telltale signs was serpentine, and the overall signature matched with the satisfying snugness of a key sliding into its lock, the output of pottery workshops in the eastern Mediterranean, in the region of southern Turkey, half a world away from the Cornish coast. So we know where the pots were born. The next question is what they were carrying, because nobody ships empty jars across an entire sea for the fun of it. Many of these vessels were amphorae, the big, heavy, sturdy storage containers that served the ancient world as its standard shipping units, the equivalent of the identical stackable bottles and cans that move liquids around our own world, mass-produced and built for long-haul transport. And what they hauled were the great luxuries of the Mediterranean, olive oil and wine, the very products that an island too far north to grow olives or ripen grapes could obtain in no other way than by trade. Picture the journey those jars made. They were filled in the warm eastern Mediterranean, loaded onto ships, and carried the entire length of that inland sea, past the coast of North Africa and the great old port near Carthage, out through the narrow Gate of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean spills into the Atlantic, and then north, up the wild ocean coast, all the way to the rocks of southwestern Britain, a voyage of thousands of miles, around the early to middle decades of the 6th century. Somebody went to enormous trouble and considerable risk to deliver oil and wine to this clifftop. They would only have done so if there was something here worth coming for. There was, and it was the same thing that had drawn merchants to these shores since the dawn of metalworking: tin. The southwestern peninsula of Britain held some of the richest tin deposits in the known world, and this unglamorous grey metal was anything but unimportant. because tin was the essential ingredient that turned soft copper into hard, useful bronze, which meant that whoever controlled the tin held something the entire ancient world needed. Britain had been famous for it for well over 1,000 years, its remote tin coast the stuff of legend among Mediterranean traders long before the Romans ever came, and the evidence that this trade was still very much alive in these centuries is solid, quite literally, because off the coast of Devon divers recovered ingots of tin so pure, better than 99%, that they testify to a sophisticated and ongoing industry, the same prized British metal that had supplied the classical world for ages. So the relationship was not one of a poor backward island gratefully receiving charity from its betters. It was a genuine exchange between equals with something each other wanted. The Mediterranean sent its oil and wine. Britain sent the metal that the Mediterranean could not do without. Far from cap in hand, the islanders were holding one of the more valuable cards in the whole game. It is worth noticing, too, that not everything arriving on these ships was bulk cargo sloshing about in big jars. Mixed in among the broken sherds was a finer class of import altogether, elegant red tableware, the good dishes and serving vessels of the Mediterranean, the sort of thing a household used to dine in style rather than to store its oil. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Importing barrels of wine tells you people wanted a drink. Importing the fashionable crockery to serve it in tells you they wanted to drink it properly, in the current Mediterranean manner, with the right plates on the table. The lords of this windswept rock were not simply consuming foreign goods. They were keeping up with continental fashion, dining as a sophisticated host anywhere in the wider Christian world might dine, and that is the behaviour of people who saw themselves as full participants in a shared culture, not as isolated provincials grateful for whatever washed ashore. They knew what good taste looked like, and they were determined to have it, all the way out here on the rocks at the edge of the ocean, and none of it would have reached them without the sailors, who deserve a moment of awe all their own, because the voyage we have been describing so casually was a genuinely audacious undertaking. To carry a heavy cargo of jars from the eastern Mediterranean out into the open Atlantic and up an exposed, weather-beaten coast was to gamble against storms, rocks, and the sheer distance involved, in vessels with none of the instruments or safety nets a modern sailor would consider essential. These were long, dangerous, expensive expeditions, undertaken only because the profit at the end justified the risk, and the fact that they were made at all, repeatedly, across these supposedly dark decades, is its own quiet proof that Britain was no forgotten dead end. You do not run a perilous long-haul shipping route to a place that has nothing to offer and nobody worth visiting. The ships kept coming because the island kept being worth the journey, year after year, cargo after cargo. The places where these exchanges actually happened add a final vivid splash of colour because the trade did not take place in dreary counting houses. Up and down the southwestern coast, archaeologists have identified a string of what can only be called beach gatherings, open shorelines where the imported pottery turns up in heaps alongside the unmistakable remains of feasting. On one such beach the ground yielded hundreds of fragments of foreign pottery and the blackened scars of numerous hearths, fire pits littered with the charred bones of animals that had been roasted and eaten on the spot. This was not a quiet handover of cargo. This was an event, a great open-air feast where the arrival of a foreign ship became the occasion for a gathering, a coming together of people to eat, drink the newly landed wine, and do business in the open air with the sea at their backs. One imagines it was the social highlight of the season, the moment the wider world physically washed up on the local sand. And that points to what these gatherings really meant, because a feast where strangers from distant lands mingle with the local elite is never only about swapping goods. When a ship arrives from the far side of the known world, it brings far more than its cargo. It brings news of distant events, fashions in dress and ornament, fresh ideas, gossip, technologies, and, crucially, religion, the latest currents of thought and belief flowing through the wider Christian world. The beach feast was a channel through which all of that poured into Britain, a meeting point where the island plugged itself back into the great conversation of its age. The people of this supposedly cut-off backwater were, at these gatherings, among the better-informed inhabitants of Western Europe, hearing the news of the Mediterranean fresh off the boat. Nor was this cliff-top the only point of contact, which is what turns one impressive sight into proof of a whole system. The same distinctive imported pottery, the telltale fingerprint of long-distance trade, turns up at site after site scattered around the western seaways of Britain and across the water in Ireland, at inland strongholds and coastal landings alike. Tintagel was the grandest node we can point to, but it sat within a web of connections that laced the entire western edge of these islands into the Mediterranean network, a busy maritime world of ships, harbours, and trading places linked by the sea rather than divided by it. The water that the darkness myth imagines as a barrier sealing Britain off was, for the people who actually lived along it, a highway, the fastest and easiest road they had, carrying goods and people and news up and down the coasts and out to the wider world. An island is only isolated if you think of the sea as a wall. To these communities it was the open door to everywhere. There is a tantalising possibility about why this long-distance link was flourishing precisely when it did, and it reaches all the way to the throne of the Eastern Empire. These were the years of one of the most ambitious emperors of the age, a ruler in the great city on the Bosphorus who dreamed of restoring the lost glory of Rome, and was busy reconquering swathes of the western Mediterranean that the empire had lost. An emperor with grand designs on the west would have every reason to cultivate the Christian rulers of distant lands, to draw the old elite of the far western edge back into the orbit of the empire and the faith, and one of the gentlest and most effective tools of such diplomacy has always been the cultivation of taste and connection through luxury. Seen in that light, those jars of fine oil and wine arriving on the Cornish coast may have been more than mere merchandise. They may have been the soft, fragrant edge of a calculated charm offensive, an imperial effort to remind the lords of the far west that they too belonged to a great and reviving Christian world, with the gifts of the Mediterranean serving as the warm handshake. Whether or not that grand design lay behind it, the effect was the same. Britain was being courted, not abandoned. So the headland that legend turned into the cradle of a mythical king reveals a truth that is, in its way, far more extraordinary than the myth. Tintagel was not Camelot. It was something better, a real and bustling gateway through which the island connected to a trading network that stretched across the entire known world, from the southwest coast of Britain to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean and the heart of the surviving empire. The wild edge of the earth turns out to have been not an edge at all, but a doorway, swung wide open to the world, with the wine flowing in and the tin flowing out, and the news of distant lands carried on every tide. The isolation, that last great pillar of the darkness, collapses as completely as all the others, an island that ships its metal to the eastern Mediterranean and dines off Turkish crockery while sipping imported wine is not lost at the edge of the world. It is a confident trading partner with a seat at the table, doing business across the entire span of the known earth. And once that doorway is open, it becomes obvious that what flowed through it was never just oil and metal, because trade has always carried words and ideas alongside its cargo. And this brings us to the most insulting accusation of all levelled against these centuries, the charge that they were illiterate, a cultural blank, a long stupid silence between the eloquence of Rome and the learning that would supposedly have to be reintroduced from outside much later. It is the assumption that with the schools of the empire gone, the people of Britain simply forgot how to read and write and think, sinking into a wordless gloom. It is also, like every other pillar of the myth, the precise opposite of the truth, and the evidence that demolishes it ranges from the polished prose of a furious monk to the secret poetry hidden in roadside stones. Begin with the monk, a 6th century churchman remembered as Gildas, who sat down in the middle of this supposedly dark age and composed a long and blistering work of Latin, denouncing the kings and clergymen of his day for their many sins. Set aside for a moment what he was complaining about and look instead at how he wrote, because the how is what matters here. Gildas did not write in some crude, broken, half-forgotten kitchen Latin. He wrote in elegant, sophisticated, highly literary Latin, dense with classical references and biblical allusions, the kind of polished, elusive prose that only makes sense if you're writing for readers cultivated enough to catch every reference and appreciate every flourish. You do not lace your work with subtle echoes of the great authors if your audience has never heard of them. The very style of his writing proves the existence of the thing the darkness myth insists could not have existed, which is an educated reading public, a body of people who shared a deep classical and religious education and could savour a clever piece of Latin prose. And his work did not vanish into a hole. It was copied, circulated and read right across Western Europe, travelling far beyond Britain and reaching in time the learned circle around the great Pope in Rome, who would later send his famous mission to the island. A genuinely isolated, illiterate backwater does not produce a bestseller that the most sophisticated minds of the continent feel obliged to read. There is a delicious irony folded into this, because the work is at heart a grand lament about ruin and decline, a furious sermon insisting that Britain had fallen into wickedness and disaster. Generations of later readers seized on its gloom as eyewitness confirmation that the lights really had gone out. But the medium quietly refutes the message. A man who can sit down amid supposed collapse and produce a masterpiece of ornate Latin rhetoric, confident that learned readers across Europe will appreciate it, is himself living proof that civilization had done nothing of the sort. The very eloquence of the complaint disproves the complaint. And there is a further telling detail, because for all his sweeping survey of the troubles of his island and its squabbling rulers, this contemporary witness never once mentions the legendary king whose shadow has loomed over our whole story. The man best placed to record a great national hero, writing in the very century such a figure was supposed to have lived, simply does not bring him up, which tells you a good deal about how much of the later legend was genuine history and how much was later embroidery. What Gildas gives us instead is something rarer and more valuable than a fairy tale king. He gives us the unmistakable sound of a living, literate, argumentative culture talking to itself in polished Latin. If Gildas shows us the literacy of the learned elite, the next body of evidence shows us that the written word reached far deeper into society than a handful of monks, and it had been sitting in plain sight, dismissed and patronized, for a very long time. Scattered across the western parts of Britain stand hundreds of inscribed stones, memorials raised by ordinary people to mark graves and commemorate the dead, carved with words and erected in the open for all to see. For generations, scholars looked at these stones and saw only crudeness. The lettering seemed irregular, the layout awkward, the whole thing a clumsy provincial scrawl, exactly the sort of fumbling, half-competent effort you would expect from a people who had lost the polish of Rome and were dimly remembering how letters worked. They were taken as proof of decline, the graffiti of a fading civilization. As it turns out, the scholars were the ones who could not read properly. The man who exposed the mistake was the Latin specialist David Howlett, an editor of the great dictionary of medieval Latin housed at the Bodleian Library, a person who had spent his life immersed in exactly the kind of learned wordcraft these centuries were supposed to have lost. When Howlett studied the inscriptions on these supposedly crude stones, he found nothing crude about them at all. He found poetry. The texts that earlier eyes had dismissed as clumsy scrawls were in fact carefully composed verse, built in the demanding classical meters of formal Latin poetry, the rhythmic patterns that take real training and a real ear to handle. These were not the fumblings of half-literate amateurs. They were the polished work of people who knew the rules of high poetic composition and applied them with skill on stone for the public eye. The clumsiness was never in the carving. It was in the modern assumption that nothing sophisticated could possibly have come out of this age. The deeper Howlett looked, the more elaborate the craftsmanship turned out to be, because the sophistication went well beyond simply writing in metre. He found that these texts were built according to intricate hidden architectures, carefully balanced and proportioned, with words and lines arranged in deliberate patterns of symmetry and number, the kind of structural games that the most learned Latin authors of the wider Christian world were playing at the very same time. In other words, the people composing these provincial gravestones were not working in isolation from the high literary culture of the continent. They were fluent in its most demanding techniques, the elaborate compositional rules that signalled a truly educated mind, and they were applying those techniques with confidence in a far-flung corner of the world that was supposed to have lost touch with such things entirely. To read one of these inscriptions properly is to realise you're looking not at a rough country headstone but at a tightly constructed work of art. Every element placed on purpose by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and expected at least a few readers to be clever enough to notice. And then Howlett found something that lifts the whole story from impressive to genuinely thrilling, because hidden inside one of these inscriptions was a secret. Woven into the structure of the text, readable only if you knew to look for it, was an acrostic, a name spelled out by the arrangement of the lines, the cunning signature of the person who had composed the piece, and the name concealed in the stone belonged to a woman remembered as Viola. Stop and consider what that single buried name means. Someone in this supposedly illiterate Dark Age was not merely literate, but so confident a master of Latin verse that she could embed a hidden self-portrait into the very architecture of her poem, a private flourish for the few, sharp enough to spot it, a wink across 15 centuries from a woman the standard story insists could not even have existed. It is the work of a sophisticated literary mind playing an elegant game, and it was carved in stone in a corner of the world we were told had forgotten how to read. That woman was not the only one of her kind either, because the stones preserve other glimpses of women fully woven into this literate, learned culture. One memorial commemorates a most holy woman, the wife of a churchman, and praises her in terms that tell you exactly how she was valued, declaring that she was esteemed above gold and precious gems, not for her wealth or her beauty, but for her character and her wisdom. A society that honours a woman in carved Latin for her wisdom, that ranks her good sense and her virtue above any treasure, is not a society that has sunk into brutish ignorance. It is one in which learning and moral seriousness were prized, in which women as well as men could be celebrated for the quality of their minds, and in which the skill to record such praise in formal verse was alive and well in the hands of ordinary communities burying their dead. It helps to think about everything a single one of these inscribed stones actually required, because each one is the tip of a much larger social iceberg. For a memorial in polished Latin verse to exist at all, a whole chain of literate effort had to be in place. Someone had to be educated enough to compose the verse in the first place, mastering the meter and the structure. Someone had to be skilled enough to carve those letters accurately into hard stone, which means a craftsman who could read what he was cutting. The family who commissioned it had to value such a thing and understand what it said. And above all, there had to be an audience, passers-by and mourners and neighbours capable of reading the words and appreciating the achievement, because there is no point hiding an acrostic in a poem if literally nobody can read the poem. A single stone, in other words, implies a community, a web of people across different walks of life who could all handle the written word to one degree or another. Multiply that by the hundreds of such stones that survive, and the picture is not of a rare flicker of literacy in a sea of ignorance, but of writing woven right through the fabric of ordinary life. It helps to ask where all this learning actually lived, because it did not float in the air. Its home was the church, and in particular the monasteries that were taking root across the western parts of Britain, and the neighbouring island of Ireland in exactly these centuries. These were not yet the great wealthy abbeys of later ages, but they were already serious centres of study, places where Latin was taught, manuscripts were copied, scripture was pored over, and the craft of fine composition was kept alive and handed on. Far from being the last embers of a dying tradition, these Western religious houses were becoming powerhouses of scholarship, and within a few generations they would be confident enough to start exporting their learning back outward, sending teachers, scholars, and missionaries across the sea to help relight education in places that the upheavals of the age had left dimmer than Britain itself. The supposedly benighted fringe was, in truth, fast becoming one of the brightest reservoirs of learning in the whole of Western Europe, the place others would soon come to in search of teachers. The stones carry one more clue to just how sophisticated this world was, because a good number of them are written twice over. Alongside their Latin, many of these Western monuments also bear an entirely separate script, a spare system of notches and strokes cut along the edges of the stone, the writing used for the Irish language that flourished across the water. To raise a memorial inscribed in two scripts and reflecting more than one language is not the act of a people clinging to a single half-remembered skill. It is the act of a confident, connected, multilingual culture, at ease with more than one written tradition, and in close contact with its neighbours, recording its dead in whichever form suited the mixed communities of the Western seaways. Far from a society that had lost its grip on writing, this was one juggling several kinds of it at once. Howlett drew from all this a conclusion that flips the entire darkness narrative inside out, and it rests on a beautiful linguistic irony. Everywhere else in the former Western Empire, in the lands that had once been the Roman heartlands of Gaul, Spain, and Italy, the Latin that people spoke in daily life was steadily mutating, sliding and drifting and breaking down into the early forms of the languages we now call the Romance tongues, the ancestors of French, Spanish, and Italian. The people there still spoke a kind of Latin, but it was a living, changing, increasingly informal Latin, and the pure literary language was being eroded by the very fact that everyone used a sloppy spoken version of it every day. The Britons were in a completely different position. They did not speak Latin in the street. Their everyday language was a Celtic one, utterly unrelated, which meant that for them Latin was never a casual spoken habit drifting toward decay. It was a language they had to learn deliberately, formally, from books, as a thing of study and reverence. And so, paradoxically, the people on the supposedly benighted fringe of Europe ended up preserving and learning a purer, more correct, more genuinely classical Latin than the inhabitants of the old Roman lands themselves, precisely because they came to it as scholars, rather than as native speakers letting it slide. The edge of the world had become a custodian of the language the centre was busy mangling. Put the polished sermon, the hidden poems, the celebrated women, and the carefully preserved classical Latin together, and the very phrase Dark Ages begins to look not just wrong, but almost comically so. This was not a wordless silence between two eras of light. It was a flourishing, a place where learning was treasured, where poetry was composed and concealed and carved, where a furious monk could expect an educated readership across a continent, where a woman could sign her verse in a secret code, and where the great inherited language of civilization was guarded more faithfully than in the lands of its birth. If you insist on the metaphor of light at all, then the honest verdict is the reverse of the legend. Nobody dimmed the lamp in these centuries. If anything, in the studies and the scriptoria and the workshops of the western British coast, somebody quietly reached over and turned it up. By now the great gloomy story has lost almost every pillar that held it up. The cities went on living, the fields went on feeding their people, the sea carried in wine and ideas from the far side of the world, and learning not only survived but flourished in elegant Latin verse carved into roadside stone. Pillar by pillar the darkness has crumbled. But one enormous claim still stands, the biggest and most cherished of them all, the founding myth that gives the whole period its supposed climax and even gives a country its name. It is the story of the Anglo Saxon invasion, the tale that says all of this British world was swept away in a tide of Germanic warriors, who crossed the North Sea, slaughtered or scattered the natives, and built England fresh on the ruins. The very word England, the land of the Angles, seems to announce the conquest in plain sight. So if we are going to finish the job, this is the wave we have to ride straight into, and it turns out to be far less of a wave than a slow change of clothes. The version most of us absorbed is suitably dramatic. Boatloads of Angles, Saxons and Jutes come pouring across the water, fierce and pagan and numberless, overwhelming the soft, Romanized Christian Britons who had grown helpless once the legions left. The natives are killed, enslaved, or driven into the remote western corners of the island, into the hills of Wales and the moors of the southwest, while the newcomers seize the good land and remake it in their own image, replacing one people wholesale with another. It is ethnic cleansing on an island scale, a clean and total break, and it has the great storytelling virtue of a clear before and after, the death of British Britain and the birth of English England. The only problem with this gripping narrative is that almost nothing in the ground actually supports it, and a good deal in the ground flatly contradicts it. Start with the single, most magnificent piece of evidence the period has to offer, the place that ought, if the invasion story were true, to give us the perfect portrait of a conquering Germanic warlord. In a field in the east of the country lay buried an entire ship, dragged up from the river and laid in the earth as the tomb of a king, and when it was excavated on the very eve of the Second World War, it proved to be one of the richest burials ever found anywhere in Northern Europe. The treasures inside were staggering: a great ceremonial helmet, gold and garnet jewellery of breathtaking craftsmanship, a heavy gold belt buckle, an ornate purse spilling coins, weapons and drinking vessels, and all the gleaming apparatus of royal power. This was the grave of someone who wanted very badly to be remembered as a mighty king, and at first glance it looks like the smoking gun of the Anglo-Saxon conquest, the resting place of one of the triumphant invaders. Look more closely at where all that treasure came from, though, and the simple story begins to dissolve. The objects in that ship had been gathered from across the entire known world. There was silver from the Eastern Empire, the great Christian power on the Bosphorus we visited at the western trade routes. There was gold work in the Frankish style from across the Channel. The dazzling red stones set into the jewellery had been carried from astonishing distances, possibly from as far away as the Indian subcontinent. This was not the plunder of a simple raider who had just stepped off a longboat. It was a deliberate, curated collection of the most prestigious and exotic objects money and connection could obtain, assembled to make a single overwhelming statement about the power and reach of the man it honoured. And the dynasty that buried him was busy doing something even more telling than collecting treasure. They were inventing themselves. These so-called Saxon kings were constructing a grand pedigree, tracing their bloodline back to gods and heroes, manufacturing a divine and royal ancestry to justify their rule. They were not foreigners importing a ready-made kingship. They were local powers building a brand new royal identity out of whatever impressive materials they could gather, exactly the sort of self-made authority we watched rising from the old forts and hill forts, only now dressed in even greater splendour. The grandest Anglo Saxon grave in the land is, on inspection, less the trophy of a conqueror than the showroom of a self-promoting local dynasty with excellent taste and global shopping habits. Two objects from that burial make the point with particular force. One is the famous face-covering helmet, a fearsome ceremonial mask of a thing, far too splendid and too fragile ever to have seen a real battlefield, an item built not for fighting but for awe. For the moment a ruler appeared before his people transformed into something more than human. The other is stranger still, a great carved stone bar topped with a fitting that turned it into a kind of staff or sceptre, an object with no practical use whatsoever, beyond declaring that the person holding it had the right to rule. Neither of these is the gear of a rough sea raider. They are the deliberate regalia of monarchy, props in the theatre of kingship, made to manufacture the impression of legitimate, almost sacred authority. Somebody was working very hard to look like a king, which is exactly what you do when you're in the business of becoming one rather than simply inheriting a title everyone already accepts without question. The dynasty behind the burial took that manufacturing of legitimacy further than mere objects, because they reached all the way back to the gods. The royal lines of these emerging kingdoms made a habit of tracing their ancestry to a great pagan deity, weaving genealogies that ran their bloodline straight up to a divine founder. The better to argue that their right to rule was written into the order of the cosmos itself. It was, to put it gently, a flexible approach to family history, the ancient equivalent of inventing an impressive coat of arms for a family that had only recently come into money. And the burial itself sits right on the seam of a changing world, because mixed in among its treasures were objects that hint at the new Christian faith arriving, even as the old pagan rites of ship burial were being performed, a man sent into the afterlife hedging his spiritual bets in much the way we saw the villa owners do generations earlier. This was not a culture frozen in barbarian simplicity. It was a sophisticated, ambitious, religiously complicated world in the very act of reinventing itself and reaching for every source of prestige, earthly and divine, that it could lay its hands on. But a single royal burial, however dazzling, cannot settle the question of what happened to ordinary people, and for that we need a place where the daily life of the whole community was recorded continuously, straight through the supposed catastrophe. Such a place exists, and it was excavated on a scale that few sites anywhere can match by the archaeologist Dominic Powell's land, who spent years peeling back an enormous stretch of landscape in the north of the country. What he uncovered was a settlement so long-lived it almost defies belief. A sprawling site strung out along a great length of ground that had been continuously occupied for something on the order of 4,000 years. Here, if anywhere, the great rupture should be written plainly into the soil, a clear horizon where Roman Britain ends in fire and Anglo Saxon England begins in conquest. What makes this site such a uniquely powerful witness is precisely its scale and its longevity. Most excavations are small windows, a trench here, a building plot there, glimpses too narrow to be sure whether what they show is typical or freakish. This was something altogether different. A vast stretch of landscape opened up and read as a whole, a settlement that had migrated slowly back and forth across the same ground for millennia, leaving an enormous, continuous, layered record of itself. When you can examine that much of a community across that much time, you are no longer guessing from fragments. You are reading the long autobiography of an entire place, and a place that lived through the supposed invasion from beginning to end is exactly the witness you want, when the question is whether that invasion wiped everything away. A small trench might miss the catastrophe by chance. A site this size, watched across the whole crucial span, gives the catastrophe nowhere to hide. So when it fails to appear, that absence carries real weight. It simply is not there. Powell's land dug through the very centuries when the invasion was supposed to have torn the country apart, and he found no sign of the cataclysm at all. There were no mass graves of the slaughtered. There was no layer of ash and destruction marking the burning of the old world. There was no abrupt break, no violent red line in the earth separating a Roman before from a Saxon after. What he found instead was continuity. The same place lived in by the same kind of community, going about its business across the supposed apocalypse without missing a step. What did change was far more modest and far more human. The fashions changed. People began dressing differently, favouring new styles of brooch and ornament, taking up different kinds of weapon, adopting new customs for burying their dead. The material culture shifted. The look and feel of things moved with the times, but the underlying community carried on. It was not a replacement of people, it was a change of style, the difference between a town being conquered and a town simply updating its wardrobe over a few generations, which, as transformations go, is rather less apocalyptic than the legend demands. If the things people owned had changed but the settlement had not, the obvious next question is whether the people themselves had changed, and here the bodies in the ground can be made to speak with remarkable precision, thanks to a beautiful piece of chemistry. As a person grows up, the water they drink and the food they eat, drawn from the local rocks and soil of wherever they spend their childhood, leave a permanent chemical signature locked into the enamel of their teeth, a signature that varies from region to region according to the underlying geology. That signature never changes afterward, no matter where life carries them, which means that centuries later a scientist can examine a person's tooth enamel and work out with real confidence the kind of place where that individual grew up. The specialist Paul Budd, working at Durham, applied this method to a couple of dozen skeletons from that long-lived northern community, expecting perhaps to find a population of incomers from across the sea if the invasion story held any water. The result was a quiet demolition of the whole conquest narrative. Of the 24 people tested, only a tiny handful, just 4, had grown up anywhere other than locally, and the identity of those few outsiders is the detail that turns the legend completely on its head. They were not a warrior aristocracy of conquering Germanic chieftains lording it over a subdued native population. They were women, buried without any particular grandeur, who had come from across the North Sea, modest immigrants rather than conquerors. And more striking still, a large share of the rest of the community had grown up not in the east at all but in the west of Britain, in the upland country toward the other coast, meaning that the people living in this supposedly Anglo Saxon settlement were overwhelmingly British, with a small leaven of incomer women among them. The cemetery that looked, from its grave goods, like the resting place of invaders turned out, when the bones themselves were questioned, to be full of locals who had taken up a new fashion. The Saxons, on this evidence, were mostly Britons in different brooches. None of this means that nobody crossed the sea, or that the period was free of violence, and it would be just as foolish to swing to that opposite extreme as it was to believe the total conquest in the first place. People certainly did come over from the nearby continent. The incomer women in that cemetery prove it, and there were surely raids, battles, displaced families, and genuine hardship in many places, because that is what the human story looks like in every age. The argument is not that the arrival of these newcomers was a gentle, bloodless affair in which everyone held hands. The argument is narrower and far better supported, which is simply that whatever migration and conflict occurred, it did not amount to the wholesale extermination and replacement of one people by another. Real movement of people, yes. The death of a nation, no. Those are entirely different claims, and the evidence comfortably supports the first while flatly refusing the second. And once you stop to think about the sheer arithmetic of it, the total replacement idea starts to look not just unsupported but close to impossible. Britain at the end of the Roman period held a substantial population, very likely numbering in the millions, the accumulated descendants of everyone who had farmed and built and lived across the centuries we have been exploring. To replace a population that size, you would need an absolutely colossal influx of newcomers, vast fleets ferrying hundreds of thousands of people across the North Sea in small open boats and somehow feeding and settling them all while eliminating the existing millions, a logistical undertaking that beggars belief for the technology of the age. The numbers simply do not work. A comparatively modest stream of incomers, even an influential and well-armed one, cannot physically have swamped and erased a population of that scale. What it could do, and what the evidence suggests it did, was establish itself as a new dominant element, set the fashion, supply the new ruling families, and gradually draw the existing majority into a new way of identifying themselves. That is not replacement. That is takeover by trend-setting, which is a great deal less dramatic but a great deal more plausible. The genetic evidence, which you might hope would settle everything cleanly, instead does something almost more useful, which is to demonstrate honestly just how complicated the truth really is. Scientists studying the DNA of the modern and ancient population have argued the question back and forth with considerable vigour. Some, reading the patterns inherited down the male line, have concluded that a substantial number of men did arrive from the nearby continent, enough to leave a serious mark on the population. Others, working in the very same field, and sometimes the very same institution, have read the data quite differently and argued for a far smaller incomer contribution. When equally qualified experts looking at the same genetic evidence end up sharply disagreeing about how many people actually crossed the sea, the one thing you can say for certain is that the answer is not the simple, total, tidy population replacement of the old story. The genetics do not hand us a clean conquest. They hand us a muddle, a mixture, a question still being argued, which is exactly what you would expect if the reality was gradual blending rather than wholesale invasion. The mechanism by which a small dominant group can reshape a whole population without ever coming close to replacing it is something history has demonstrated again and again, and it is worth spelling out because it dissolves so many of the apparent puzzles. When a confident, well-organized minority takes the top of a society, controls the land and the power and the prestige, the people beneath them face a simple, practical choice: to get on, to prosper, to marry well, to avoid trouble and seize opportunity. It pays to look and sound like the new people at the top, to adopt their dress, their customs, their names, and above all their language. Over a few generations, with no need for any massacre, the majority can quietly remake itself in the image of the ruling minority, until the grandchildren of the conquered are indistinguishable in speech and style from the descendants of the newcomers, all of them now thinking of themselves as one people. The native population does not die. It converts, for the very sensible reason that fitting in beats standing out. It is a process driven not by swords but by ambition and the universal human desire to be on the winning side, and it leaves behind exactly the kind of evidence we actually find: a change of culture sitting on top of an unbroken population. There is, admittedly, one stubborn fact that the invasion theory has always pointed to as its trump card, and it is a good one, so it deserves a proper answer. If the Britons were not wiped out and replaced, then why on earth does England speak English, a Germanic language, rather than a descendant of the Celtic tongue the Britons actually spoke? Surely the death of the old language proves the death of the old people. But language does not work that nicely, and history is full of populations who change their speech without being exterminated, adopting the tongue of a dominant or prestigious group over a few generations while remaining, in their blood and their bones, exactly who they had always been. People switch languages for advantage, for status, to get on in a world run by new masters, and they do it without anyone needing to be killed. And there is a fascinating clue buried in English itself that points this way, because some scholars argue that the grammar of the language carries a kind of hidden Celtic accent, certain underlying structural habits that do not come from its Germanic relatives and look very much like the fingerprints of British speakers who took up the new language while unconsciously carrying over the deep patterns of their old one. If they are right, then English is not the language of a people who replaced the Britons. It is partly the language the Britons themselves built when they learned to speak like their new neighbours, their ancestral grammar still faintly humming underneath the foreign words. The tongue changed. The mouths it sat in largely did not. The map of England quietly backs this up, because the Britons left their words written all over the landscape even after they stopped speaking their own language. Look at the names of the great rivers in particular, and you find that an astonishing number of them are not English at all but Celtic, the old British names for the waters, preserved unchanged in the mouths of people who had otherwise switched to a Germanic tongue. This is exactly the pattern you would expect from blending rather than replacement. When newcomers genuinely wipe out a population, the old names tend to vanish with the old people. But when newcomers settle among a surviving majority and gradually merge with them, they pick up the local names for things, especially for the big permanent features of the land that everybody already knew by heart. A conquered and exterminated people does not get to keep naming the rivers. A people who stayed, intermarried, and slowly adopted a new language hands those names on to their own descendants without anyone quite noticing. Every time a modern English speaker says the name of one of those ancient rivers, they are speaking a word in the language of the Britons who supposedly disappeared, a small daily ghost of a people who never actually went away, only changed how they spoke of themselves. So if the great conquest mostly did not happen, where did the overpowering belief in it come from, the conviction so strong it named a nation? For that we have to meet the single most influential storyteller in the whole of early English history, a scholarly monk who, around the year 731, sat down in his northern monastery and wrote a history of his people that would shape how that people understood themselves for more than 1,000 years. In the act of writing it, he did something extraordinary. He more or less invented the English. Before him there was no single English people, only a scatter of separate kingdoms and mixed populations with tangled origins. But he gathered them into one idea, a single chosen nation with a shared identity and a divine destiny, a people specially favoured by God. It was a brilliant and powerful piece of storytelling, and like all such stories it was written for a purpose. His great aim was to glorify a particular version of the Christian faith, the Roman mission that had arrived to convert the kingdoms of the southeast at the very end of the 6th century, sent from Rome by the famous Pope we have already met. And to make that mission shine as the true bringer of the light, he needed a darkness for it to dispel. So he wrote the older native British church almost entirely out of the story, the very church we have just seen producing its elegant Latin and its learned monasteries, casting the Britons as spiritual failures who had forfeited their place and deserved to be swept aside in favour of the new chosen people. He took a messy, blended, continuous reality and reshaped it into a clean tale of divine replacement, a fallen old people giving way to a glorious new one. It helps to know a little about the world this monk wrote from, because it explains a great deal about why his version came out the way it did. He lived and worked in one of the great centres of learning of his day, a northern monastery with a famous library, the kind of place that was, as we have seen, a powerhouse of exactly the scholarship the Dark Ages were supposed to lack. He was a careful, brilliant, genuinely learned man, not a liar, which makes him all the more persuasive and all the more worth watching closely. His church had recently triumphed in a long and bitter dispute with the older native Christian tradition over matters of practice and authority, and he wrote as a partisan of the winning side, eager to present that victory as the natural and proper order of things. To frame his people as a new chosen nation, he reached for the oldest template available, casting them in the role of a divinely favoured people entering their promised land, with the Britons assigned the part of the unworthy who had to be cleared away to make room. It is a magnificent piece of writing and a magnificent piece of propaganda, and the two are not in the least contradictory. The most effective myths are very often composed by sincere and gifted people who believe every word, which is precisely what makes them so hard to dislodge once they take hold. The proof that his version triumphed is sitting in the name of the country itself, which is perhaps the most quietly astonishing detail in the whole story. The incomers from across the sea were, on all the evidence, a minority who blended into a much larger native population, and yet it is their name, not the Britons, that the whole land came to carry. The land of one group of newcomers standing in for the identity of millions who are mostly something else entirely. A label attached by the winners stuck so firmly that it erased the arithmetic beneath it, and a country largely descended from the people who were supposedly conquered has spent 13 centuries calling itself by the name of the supposed conquerors. It is a perfect illustration of how the story we tell about the past can overwrite the past itself, how a name and a narrative, repeated long enough, can become more real to us than the bones in the ground and the chemistry in the teeth. We took the storyteller's word for it for 1300 years and only recently thought to check. And here is where the whole story comes full circle in the most satisfying way, because this is precisely the same trick we identified at the very beginning. The rewriting of the past to serve the needs of the present, performed by a brilliant monk in the 8th century just as it would later be performed by anxious gentlemen in the 19th. Both took a living, complicated, continuous history and flattened it into a dramatic tale of collapse and replacement, because a dramatic tale was more useful to them than the messy truth. The monk needed a fallen people to make his church the saviour. The later empire needed a fallen civilization to frighten itself into holding together. The Anglo Saxon conquest and the Dark Ages are not two separate myths at all. They are the same myth, the myth of the clean break, told twice by different people who each found the truth too untidy for their purposes. It is worth asking why the clean break has such a powerful grip on us, why we reach so eagerly for stories of collapse and conquest, and so reluctantly for stories of slow, muddled continuity. Part of it is simply that the dramatic version makes a better tale. A great civilization falling, a darkness descending, a heroic people sweeping in to begin the world anew, all of that has a shape, a beginning and an end, the satisfying arc of a proper story. The truth, by contrast, is a long, gradual, undramatic process of ordinary people adapting and blending over centuries, which is far harder to fit onto a memorable page. But there is something deeper at work too, because the clean break story flatters whoever tells it, letting them stand at the dawn of a brand new age rather than in the unglamorous middle of an unbroken one. It is more thrilling to be a beginning than a continuation. And so, age after age, people have preferred the tidy fiction of rupture to the messy fact of continuity, not because they were stupid or dishonest, but because the human mind genuinely finds a sharp edge easier to grasp and more pleasing to behold than a long, soft, unbroken slope. The real history asks us to give up the drama and love the slope instead, which is a harder thing to do but a far more honest one. Strip away both layers of storytelling and what remains is the real history this whole journey has uncovered, and it is a far better story than the legend ever was. There was no death of Britain and no overnight birth of England. There was instead a long, unbroken, endlessly inventive process of people getting on with their lives, adapting, absorbing, and remaking themselves. The Britons who farmed the open fields and fired the kilns and built the timber halls did not vanish. They carried on, taking in a trickle of newcomers from across the sea, adopting new fashions and new words and eventually a new name, blending the incomers into themselves until the line between native and stranger blurred away entirely, exactly as they had once absorbed Rome, taking its baths and its gods and its language and making them their own. The genius of this island was never purity. It was the opposite, a remarkable and unending talent for taking in whatever the world washed up on its shores and turning it into something that felt, within a generation or two, entirely and unmistakably its own. The identity that emerged from these centuries was not built on untainted blood or a single conquering people. It was built on mixture, on the long habit of swallowing the foreign and calling it home, a thread that runs unbroken from a hot Roman bath in the West Country, all the way to the most British thing imaginable, a comforting cup of tea brewed from leaves grown on a hillside thousands of miles away in Africa. Every supposedly timeless symbol of the island turns out, on inspection, to be something borrowed, absorbed, and made local, which is not a weakness in the story, but the whole point of it. That is not the behaviour of a civilization that died and was replaced. It is the behaviour of one that simply never stopped, that met every arrival the way it always had, by reaching out, taking what was useful, and quietly becoming something new without ever ceasing to be itself. That is the truth the silent witnesses gave back to us once we finally learned to read them. The pots and the bones, the pollen and the stones, the buried ships and the chemistry locked in ancient teeth. They told us with one quiet voice that the lamp the legend swore had been snuffed out was never extinguished at all. It burned steadily through every century it was supposed to have spent in darkness, in the busy towns and the worked fields, in the feasting halls and the trading beaches, in the carved verse and the copied manuscripts, while a people who refused to disappear simply went on living, working, praying, trading, and reinventing themselves, century after century, entirely unaware that a far later age would look back at all that life and insist on calling it the dark. The darkness, in the end, was only ever our own, a shadow we cast backward by refusing to look closely at what these remarkable people actually left behind. And now that we have looked, the shadow lifts, and the so-called Dark Ages stand revealed for what they truly were, not an ending and not a void, but one of the most quietly creative and stubbornly alive chapters in the whole long story of this endlessly absorbing island. And on that note, we have reached the end of our journey through the centuries that were never really dark. Thank you for spending this time wandering through the real history with me, beneath the legends and the myths, all the way to the truth waiting in the ground. Now go ahead and let those eyes drift closed. Let your mind settle, and rest easy knowing the lights were on the whole time. Sleep well, and good night, wherever in the world you are.